So I constantly have guns, germs, and steel brought up as an explanation for civilizational differences or why the modern world came from Europe. And this book, which I read from cover to cover with the idea of either making a video about it or radically altering my worldview yet again as I had in October, this book is environmental determinism. Part of the reason this took so long is because, honest Injuns, I was giving it, in my mind, as much of the benefit of the doubt as possible and seeing whatever truth in it I could find. Now, this is not as heroic a thing to do as you might think, as even if Jared Diamond were correct about everything he said, it would not fundamentally refute my view of the world or of the European Revolution. In fact, I was looking forward to agreeing with Jared Diamond wherever possible from a kind of cynical political strategy standpoint, as it would make me look reasonable despite not really actually costing me anything. Because environmental determinism doesn't make the biological selective pressures of agriculture and civilization disappear. Some areas may be more prone to having civilization, but that doesn't make the selective pressures of civilization just go away. Jared Diamond's thesis is factually entirely compatible with a hereditarian worldview. Were China to have geographic advantages to India, and those were the main cause for some Chinese technological superiority to India, that doesn't necessarily mean the Chinese aren't also genetically more intelligent than Indians. In fact, the geographic advantages could lead to technological advantages, which create selective pressures for intelligence, meaning the smarter people have more kids, or the other way. Greater technological advances in a civilization may make it easier to survive and thus select against intelligence. Jared's ideas, even if taken as gospel, don't preclude some populations from being biologically smarter than others, be they the classical races or any subdivisions of humanity. I was hoping to integrate what I could of Jared Diamond's ideas in order to seem reasonable, so I could say, look, I'm incorporating ideas from a leftist, which I try to do as much as I can. Unfortunately, Jared Diamond's thesis is falsified to a degree that is puzzling that he ever got the time of day. His book argues that all differences between civilizations can be chalked up entirely to environmental factors. His arguments center around the availability of domesticable plants and animals that can be used for calorie-dense staple crops or can be useful animals. He claims that Eurasia in general, and the Fertile Crescent in particular, had the best overall package of crops and domesticable animals. Its goal, which Jared states very clearly in his introduction, is to provide an explanation to civilizational differences alternative to a genetic explanation for these differences. Now, that's a bit questionable given how little genetic explanations for civilizational outcomes are even taught, but there you go. Unfortunately, he ends up not only arguing against genetic explanations, but he's actually arguing against all non-environmental explanations. He's arguing against serendipity and against the consequences of choice in any long-lasting way. I want to Iron Man his argument before going into this. Now, Jared doesn't explicitly say this, so I have to Iron Man it here. At first, the ultra-fertile rivers of the Mesopotamia and Nile had more populous and more advanced civilizations than Europe. Europe, of course, ultimately had more agricultural potential, but it was more difficult to get at because, first, Europe was covered in forests that all had to be chopped down, and second, the land wasn't as fertile per acre as Mesopotamia or the Nile. So an individual farmer along the Nile could grow far more than an individual farmer in, say, Gaul, or modern-day France, even though Gaul can produce more grain than the Nile overall. And it just took time for civilizations to become large and advanced enough to utilize the less concentrated but ultimately greater agricultural resources of Europe. But once they did, Europe shot past the Middle East. Again, Jared doesn't come out and say this, what I just said about Europe having more ultimate agricultural potential, but the river valleys being better for early agriculture. But he kind of implies it, and I would rather respond to this stronger version of Jared's arguments rather than stick to what he literally said, because I'm making this video for the audience. If I just stick to what Jared Diamond literally said, okay, well, Jared says all the best crops and animals were in the Fertile Crescent. That part of the world sucks now, and was not the region that took over the world with all the big empires. So Jared's wrong. Thanks for watching, guys. And so if I just respond to what Jared Diamond literally said, I could end the video right here with that. Because if you took what Jared Diamond says literally in his book, it's obvious that the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent should be where the Industrial Revolution happened and should be the superpower of the world today. It's not, so Jared Diamond's wrong. Thanks for watching. So you see how I have to Iron Man Jared's argument in order to have anything meaningful to respond to. In addition, what I just presented here with the river valleys being good for early civilization, but sort of the plains areas such as Europe, India, and China being better, being ultimately having more potential, that I think is a popular idea that just observers of history independently come to. And I would rather respond to that thing than with a far more limited argument that Jared Diamond literally lays out. Another thing to point out is that Jared Diamond doesn't actually have proper sources in Guns, Germs, and Steel. He has suggested reading in the back, which is, in my opinion, a form of asshole sourcing, as I call it. There are 5 instances in the book where he names a specific source in the text itself, but everything else is unsourced, or it's supposedly in there in the suggested reading, and in the 2 or 3 years it would take to read the suggested reading, maybe you'll find it. Now, if you're just wanting to shut people up who use Jared Diamond's book, that right there sinks it. If an individual wants to repeat one of the perhaps 100 or so arguments made by Jared Diamond, he is free to do so, but that's the person making that argument, and he needs to collect the sources himself because Jared Diamond does not do that in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Jared Diamond himself is not a source, or at least this book itself is not a source. If you want to say that the American peoples didn't have access to good crops or domesticable animals, that's fine, but you have to make that argument and you have to source it yourself because Jared Diamond does not do so. He asserts and then points to his suggested reading. I say Jared Diamond lacks a methodology because there's no part of the book where he says, this is how we measure if an animal can be domesticated, or this is how we can tell if all the grasses have more or less immediate yield, ease of selective breeding to a certain level, or more or less ultimate genetic potential. He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't have a standard methodology of defining when something is domesticable or not. Jared Diamond's standard in practice is that if something was domesticated, it was domesticable. If it wasn't domesticated, it wasn't domesticable. Now, this is something you pick up as you read it, and you may not, and what I'm saying right here, it sounds so stupid. I understand if you're inclined to not believe me. How could somebody with all the academic credentials and being promoted by media and with a prize-winning book, how could his position ultimately be this stupid? Okay, I suggest you read the book, and he comes very close to just outright saying this on page 132. He says, quote, a mere dozen species account for over 80% of the modern world's annual tonnage of all crops. Those dozen blockbusters are the cereals wheat, corn, rice, barley, and sorghum, the pulse soybean, the roots or tubers potato, manioc, and sweet potato, the sugar sources sugarcane and sugar beet, and the fruit banana. Cereal crops alone now account for more than half of the calories consumed by the world's human populations. With so few major crops in the world, all of them domesticated thousands of years ago, it's less surprising that many areas of the world had no wild native plants at all or outstanding potential. Our failure to domesticate even a single major new food plant in modern times suggests that ancient peoples really may have exploited virtually all useful wild plants and domesticated all of the ones worth domesticating. I was a bit shocked that he would just come out and say it like this. I read the book up to this point thinking Jared was kind of a rat by acting like the domesticability of a plant or animal was proven or disproven merely by it having been domesticated or not. But I was thinking he's a rat because he wasn't explicitly saying that this was his standard. But here, he basically just gives the game away. So I can't really say he's lying about it. He says this is his standard and he acts on it. Now, there were experiments done in the Soviet Union with foxes, rats, minks, and otters. The most famous is probably the foxes, where in 6 generations the researchers were able to breed foxes that upon first contact with humans would run up to them and snuggle with them. The least domesticated foxes, those that flee from experimenters or bite when stroked or handled, are assigned to Class 3. Foxes in Class 2 let themselves be petted and handled but show no emotionally friendly response to the experimenters. Foxes in Class 1 are friendly toward experimenters, wagging their tails and whining. In the 6th generation, bred for tameness, we had to add an even higher scoring category. Members of Class 1E, the domesticated elite, are eager to establish human contact, whimpering to attract attention, and sniffing and licking experimenters like dogs. They start displaying this kind of behavior before they are 1 month old. By the 10th generation, 18% of fox pups were elite. By the 20th, the figure had reached 35%. Today, elite foxes make up 70 to 80% of our experimentally selected population, close quote. Now, this was done very fast and very easily. It's so easy, in fact, to domesticate an animal like this that a caveman can do it, because they did it. And they did it with not just foxes, but wolves, a much larger and more dangerous animal than foxes. Similar breeding of extremely friendly and extremely aggressive rats was also done in about 30 years. And this was also done with mink and otters. So here we have at least 2 examples of animals that previously weren't domesticated, rats and foxes, that quickly became domesticated. Why 1500? This is a major problem with Jared Diamond's reasoning. Why did Europeans surpass the rest of Eurasia, particularly China, when it did? To say Europe had all these geographic advantages is nice until we look at the timeline. Let's take 3 regions, India, China, and Europe. We won't consider the Arab world in North Africa or Central Asia or Southeast Asia. And for the sake of argument, we'll just grant for now that sub-Saharan Africa was geographically disadvantaged, although I'll later argue that that's not the case. But for now, we'll just look at the 3 regions, Europe, India, China. Now, measuring the relative technological level of regions of the world in ancient times is difficult because nobody bothered to keep track of the general level of technology at the time. But for most of their history, India and China were more populous than Europe, which is evidence that those areas have more, we could call, base agricultural capacity than Europe. Either that or the Europeans were just really bad at farming, which I don't think anyone seriously believes, so we'll just say that India and China had more of a base agricultural potential than Europe. As for the very early technologies, it's hard to say, because how are we classifying Greece? How are we classifying Rome and Spain? Is Asia Minor part of Europe or the Middle East? Nowadays, it's seen as more being part of the Middle East. Turkey is, just because it's a Muslim country, but without that hard religious distinction. Is Asia Minor not just an extension of Greece, or is Greece not just an extension of Asia Minor? Another thing that most people don't recognize is just how technologically stagnant the world was up until around 1600, and even up until around 1800, not a whole lot ever got invented. And technologies would be lost, something that doesn't really happen anymore outside of Black Africa. So when we talk about technological advances pre-1800, it's a lot of chatter about very little. People kind of just didn't invent things until around the 1800s. And I would recommend Charles Murray's book, Human Accomplishment. And there's a whole bunch of ways he validates this, comparing other gross indicators of economic development with encyclopedic entries on inventions, and he uses all manners of encyclopedias, including non-European ones, which, as he shows, ends up actually being more Eurocentric than the European encyclopedias. Now, Jared Diamond's core argument about the prevalence of domesticable crops and animals, if it were true, could explain why Eurasia was ahead of Africa and the Americas. His core argument only argues why Eurasia was ahead of everywhere else. It does not argue for Europe being ahead of India and China. Jared does offer some explanations for that at the end, but those are tacked on. 90% of the book is about domesticable crops and animals and about arable land, variations which are not only do not explain Europe shooting past India and China, but are in fact a mark against his core argument, since Europe was clearly inferior to India and China in this regard. So that's it for the preliminaries. The lack of sources, the lack of a coherent methodology. Let's dig into the actual claims he makes. First, we'll talk about potatoes, maize in the Americas. Then we'll talk about the Bantu expansion in sorghum. Then we'll talk about bison, llamas, and zebras, and a little bit on horses in the Americas. I'll talk a little bit regarding Jared Diamond's likely motives for writing this book, and I'll end with just a matter-of-factly better explanation for what happened that explains why the Industrial Revolution happened where and when it did. Not only that it happened in Europe, but where in Europe, and why it was most strongly felt in England, then France, etc., etc. So let's get into it. Jared Diamond says of teosinte, quote, "Teosinte's value as food would not have impressed hunter-gatherers. It was less productive in the wild than wild wheat. It produced less seeds than did the corn eventually develop from it, and it enclosed its seeds in inedible hard coverings. For teosinte to become a useful crop, it had to undergo drastic changes in its reproductive biology, to increase greatly its investment in seeds and to lose those rock-like coverings of its seeds." So I decided to actually look up some experiments on this, comparing the pound of grain yields per acre for teosinte versus einkorn. Teosinte actually still grows wild in much of Central America to this very day. So I found from John Dobley 2 numbers for yields for teosinte. One was his own personal experiment, and his yield extrapolated to 1,030 pounds of grain per hectare. These are a bit lower than what Flannery in 1973 estimated that the average yield for teosinte would be, which was 1,384 pounds per hectare. I also found a series of experiments done at North Dakota State, Cathay and Robinson in North Dakota, Rollsboro and Freeville in New York, and Rock Springs in Pennsylvania, and compared those yields in pounds per hectare. These are yield experiments for ancient strands of einkorn, the forerunner to modern wheat, and what we can see is that teosinte, this thing, is hanging right in there with einkorn. My speculation is that if Dobley were to attempt to grow teosinte a second time, his yield would be about the same as Flannery's numbers. As Dobley said of his experiment, quote, "To estimate the yield of teosinte, I harvested the seed from 14 randomly chosen plants from one of my teosinte plants in Molokai Island in 2003. I thrashed each plant against a plastic tarp to free loose the fruit cases, and then abraded the stems some more by hand to free seed bound tightly in the leaf sheaths. I did not attempt to recover all the seed from each plant. If I had to guess, I would say I might have recovered about 50% from the average plant," close quote. Okay, so when Jared here says that wild teosinte was less productive than wild wheat, this is really speculative. This is not at all established. Now, by the time the Spaniards arrived in the Mexico Valley region, those people were no longer growing teosinte, but they were growing little corns. From Bruce Benz's paper entitled Archaeological Evidence of Teosinte Domestication from Guila-Naquitz, Oaxaca, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, please have mercy on that, it says, quote, "Analysis of the 3 most ancient zea maize corn inflorescence fragments from Guila-Naquitz, Oaxaca, Mexico, shows that they did not disarticulate naturally, indicating that agricultural selection of domesticated teosinte was underway by 5400 C years before the present, about 4200 D radio-calibrated years BC. The co-occurrence of 2 rank specimens with 2 rows and 4 rows of grain and numerous additional morphological characteristics of these specimens support hypotheses based on molecular and quantitative genetic analyses that maize evolved from teosinte. Domestication of the wild ancestor of maize occurred before the end of the 5th millennium BC." So they're saying around 4200 BC there's evidence around Mesoamerica of intentional selective breeding of teosinte because they're starting to get more little grains on each cob, quote unquote, or we're starting to get what we think of as the cob. So this claim of Jared's that hunter-gatherers wouldn't have been impressed by teosinte, well, by 4200 BC, we already know that at least someone was selectively breeding them. And if we know that by 4200 BC that they were doing it, they're probably doing it well before then. And the assertion that the rock-hard outer shell of teosinte made them useless as a food crop, as implied by saying it had to lose the rock-like coverings in order to become useful, I mean, it's obviously wrong, and it's a bizarre speculative statement when there's no need for speculation, because we know the Mesoamericans grew teosinte, we know they selectively bred it, so we know they knew how to break the casings, so what is the point of speculating that the hard casings would make growing teosinte useless? We knew that they grew it. They grew it so much that they started to selectively breed it. It's just such a weird sort of thing to say. Now, Jared Diamond has this cute line on page 96, quote, "Among the resulting controversies remaining unresolved, perhaps the most important for the purposes of this book concerns the date when food production originated in the Americas. Indirect methods of the 1960s and 1970s yielded dates as early as 7000 BC, but more recent direct dating has been yielding dates no earlier than 3500 BC. Close quote. Now, when he says more recent direct dating, he means when this book was published. Well, in addition to the previous papers showing evidence of selective breeding by 4200 BC in the Americas, selective breeding which almost certainly was going on well before that, there's a 2002 paper from Matsuoka et al. Entitled, quote, "A single domestication for maize shown by multilocus microsatellite genotyping put a start date back in 7000 BC. Right, which confirmed the previous indirect methods." Now, this is important because Jared is trying to claim that Europeans aren't anything special. In fact, he goes a little bit further than that. So he wants to say that Native Americans didn't have much time to develop civilization from agriculture, when actually they had more time than the Europeans did. I think it's also important to point to modern yields of various types of crops in the United States. I found a blog, Math Sci Notes, who made a graph from USDA data. Anyway, so I looked at his graph, and one of the crops is rather conspicuously missing on this graph: wheat. Where's the wheat? Wheat isn't included on this graph. And this is a graph for crops in the US. How peculiar that you wouldn't have wheat on this graph. So I hunted down the original source, and I made a graph out of this data, and it looks almost exactly the same as what Math Sci Notes had. Good, that's a good sign. We're doing the same thing. But I also included wheat, so here wheat is. And this is a shockingly low yield. And I think this is why Math Sci Notes didn't include wheat on the graph, because it seems like a sanity fail. Because my intuition is that wheat is a calorie-dense staple crop. Why is wheat being beaten by apples in terms of yield per acre year? But there was an article written in the Washington Post in 2014 about this, and I don't know where he got his numbers from, but he found very similar results, and this kind of surprised me. Wheat today isn't a very good staple crop. Now, it's possible that the very earliest strands of wheat were more productive than the very earliest strands of teosinte, but when white people showed up in the Americas, they would grow flint corn in preference to wheat wherever they could. There was a paper in Social Research entitled, quote, "How the Potato Changed the World's History," and in it the author William McNeil said, "But since potatoes yielded from 2 to 4 times more calories per acre than grain did, the laborers needed to cultivate them could in fact be readily sustained. A feedback process thus set in. More potatoes meant more calories, more field work in summer, and now more workers to perform it. And by planting potatoes on the fallow and using hose to eliminate weeds, there was absolutely no need to decrease grain supply. What a bonanza." So here the author, based on historical accounts, is claiming that potatoes were anywhere from 2 to 4 times as productive per acre as wheat from 1600 to 1800, which is similar to the calorie per acre year ratios we get from the USDA and from the Washington Post for modern wheat versus potatoes. So this doesn't look like a sanity fail at all. It looks like wheat just isn't that good of a staple crop. And I was a bit incredulous at this. And I was a bit concerned that if I said that, I'd be corrected and I'd look like a fool. But then I have to think, how much did I actually know about the relative yields of various crops? I imagined wheat to be a particularly high calorie yield crop because of, amber waves of grain. But when I think about it, I never actually had any good reason to think that wheat was a particularly good food staple crop. So frankly, my prior belief that wheat was a good staple crop was a prior that I never should have actually had, because I had no reason to believe that in the first place. But Jared Diamond certainly believed it. Nathan Nunn and Nancy Quain in the Quarterly Journal of Economics said that they believe that the introduction of the potato was causally responsible for about a quarter of Europe's population increase from 1700 to 1900. They say, quote, "We find that Old World regions that were suitable for potato cultivation experienced larger increases in population and urbanization after the introduction of potatoes. The estimates are robust to a number of sensitivity checks, which include controlling for a large number of alternative determinants of population and economic growth. These include legal origin, identity of the colonizer, the prevalence of disease, measured as distance from the equator and the potential prevalence of malaria, distance from the coast, a history of Roman rule, the prevalence of Protestantism, being an Atlantic trader, and the historical volume of slave exports. In addition, we show that we obtain similar results when we examine variation across countries within continents. Together, the results suggest that it is unlikely that our findings are simply capturing other historical determinants for economic development, including those factors that led to the divergence of Europe from the rest of the world. To assess the magnitudes of our estimated effects, we calculated how much of the increase from 1700 to 1900 in Old World population and urbanization can be explained by the introduction of the potato. Our baseline estimate suggests that the potato accounts for approximately 25 to 26% of the increase in total population and 27 to 34% of the increase in urbanization. So according to McNeil, once the potato was introduced, it became a popular food for poor people in Europe, while people with money ate wheat. They ate bread. In the US, even though you get way more calories per acre and year with potatoes, people like bread more. And today, given how high yields are, just about everyone can afford to eat wheat-based foods instead of the cheaper corn, rice, and potatoes, though the price of corn is getting bit up by ethanol nowadays. McNeil describes some British soldiers who had been given land in Ireland from their campaigns with Cromwell. And the British ended up leaving because they wanted to grow wheat in Ireland, and they wanted to sell. And when they found they couldn't grow wheat, they just left because they weren't interested in being subsistence potato farmers. They wanted to make money, and you made money by growing wheat, not by growing potatoes. You grew potatoes to eat, you grew wheat to sell to people with money. Now, the Scottish settlers in Ulster were willing to grow potatoes, and so they stayed on as subsistence potato farmers in Northern Ireland, and today they're known as the Ulster Scots. Today, in the US and Europe, wheat is grown over more acres than either potatoes or corn, and this is probably because wheat sells better. But if we're talking about the early staples needed to get the calories needed to start early civilizations, potatoes straight away and corn very quickly starts to out-yield wheat. If you're trying to min-max calories, you're probably going to want to grow maize, potatoes, rice, and sugarcane. Obviously, different crops grow better in different areas, so you wouldn't want to grow all maize all the time in places that can't grow maize. But if you're trying to min-max calories, you'd probably never grow wheat. And this is a profound fact, because a big chunk of Jared Diamond's thesis is that the Fertile Crescent and the wheats in the Fertile Crescent have these wonderful wheat grasses that had amazing yields, but certainly the fact that modern wheat today sucks on a calorie per acre basis compared to modern rice, maize, and potatoes should make one skeptical that ancient wheat was so much better back then. And on top of this, what we know from the 1600s to 1800s and experimental data comparing teosinte to ancient einkorn, this should all call into question this idea that the ancient grains of the Fertile Crescent were something special. So I looked at the Wikipedia article on amaranth, and they showed how calorie-dense amaranth was. I was able to find agricultural experiment data on amaranth from the University of Minnesota at Rosemount and from the Rodale Research Institute, and based on the pound per acre yields, I came up with these calorie per acre year values. Obviously, if any of these variables are wrong, my numbers are wrong, and the Minnesota Rosemount numbers are a lot higher than the Rodale numbers. Again, for everything I do, if you want to nitpick, that's fine, but keep in mind that Jared Diamond did none of this. He has nothing like this showing relative yields of crops in any quantitative sense. His book is pure narrative. He mentions amaranth in passing a few times, but he doesn't mention that it very easily could have been more calorie productive per acre year than einkorn was. It's not my job to disprove Jared Diamond. He's the one who needs to show things like ancient wheat actually being more productive than things like amaranth, which existed in North America. And he didn't because he's a hack. One thing Jared Diamond brings up as a general theme is that it is easier for crops to spread east-west than north-south. And it seems intuitively plausible. After all, there's less variation in average temperature going east-west than there is north-south. And when Jared Diamond says this, along with the barriers of geography, are why crops in the New World didn't spread from one region to another as quickly as they did in the Old World, if at all. He says the northernmost extent of the Andean civilization was around 1,200 miles from the southernmost extent of Mesoamerican civilization, and they apparently had no contact, despite this actually being a smaller distance than the extent of Rome, China, the Mongol, and many other empires of Eurasia, and that this lack of contact had to do with the axis of Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations being north-south instead of east-west. Quote, as striking as these effects of barriers on crop and livestock diffusion are the effects of other features of human societies. Alphabets of ultimately Mediterranean origin spread throughout all of complex societies of Eurasia, from England to Indonesia, except for areas of East Asia where derivatives of the Chinese writing system took hold. In contrast, the New World's sole writing systems, those of Mesoamerica, never spread to the complex Andean and Eastern U.S. societies that might have adopted them. The wheel is invented in Mesoamerica as parts of toys, never met llamas, and domesticated in the Andes to generate wheeled transport for the New World. From east to west in the Old World, the Macedonian Empire and the Roman Empire both spanned 3,000 miles, the Mongol Empire 6,000 miles, but the empires and states of Mesoamerica had no political relations with, and apparently never seen or heard of, the chiefdoms of the eastern United States 700 miles to the north, or the empires and states of the Andes 1,200 miles to the south. Now, Jared's actually doing a little bit of a shell game here. He's conflating crop diffusion with political contact and exploration, when these two things are, quite simply, not the same thing at all. When the Mongols were administering southern China, it's not because there was some continuous nature of food production and consumption going from Ulaanbaatar to Guangxi. And the most glaring example of exploration and crop diffusion not being the same thing is when Europeans, by a mixture of warfare and mass settlement, took over the Americas. There was a clear barrier to crop diffusion there, and yet the Europeans had contact there. Right? You don't need the crops to diffuse to get on a boat and contact or conquer. And it's very subtle, but we can look at the Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations' lack of contact over not too far a distance as being a reflection of their internal characteristics, but Jared Diamond is trying to transmute the results of their choice as being a result of the crops not spreading from one region to another. Again, it's a very linguistic sleight of hand. The empire of Alexander of Macedon. He was the king of Macedonia. Now, why don't we sit back and think up all the reasons why there's no possible way for Alexander to have conquered an empire all the way to the Indus Valley? Well, logistics for one. He had to travel all the way across Anatolia, all those mountains and hills and rivers. How does he garrison the area? He'll have to rely on troops from the region he has conquered to garrison. And given that his supply line is so long, it only has to be cut by these foreign garrison troops at one point. Also, there's the small task of actually defeating these much larger states with much larger armies, assuming Alexander can even take control of Greece itself. And not only that, but take over Greece without killing too many of the combat-age male population within Greece. Now, obviously, Jared Diamond isn't talking about military actions here, but it's the same sort of problem. It's just so stories. Jared Diamond says that maize wasn't cultivated in the Mississippi Valley region until around 900 AD because it took that many thousands of years for it to travel that distance and for maize to adopt to the climate because of the north-south axis. He says, quote, for thousands of years after corn was domesticated in Mexico, it failed to spread northward into eastern North America because the cooler climates and shorter growing season prevailing there. At some time between 81 and 8200, corn finally appeared in the eastern United States, but only as a very minor crop. Not until around 8900, after hardy varieties of corn adapted to northern climates had been developed, could corn-based agriculture contribute to the flowering of the most complex Native American society of North America, the Mississippi culture. A brief flowering ended by European introduced germs arriving with and after Columbus. So here's where maize, then what we would call flint corn, was being farmed in 2800 BC. And here's an average annual temperature map of the region. And here's a precipitation map of the area, again with maize cultivation approximately overlaid. So I don't see it, Jared. In addition, I've read many papers on maize growing and the introduction of maize into the eastern US, and nobody mentions some terrific adaptation necessary for maize to be grown in the Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana region. And when we look at the expansion of the core primordial maize growing region here, what we see is that it jumped all the way to around Cusco and north all the way up to Arizona and New Mexico. It didn't take billions or trillions of years to adapt to each region. Moreover, when the Spanish arrived, they took maize seeds straight from the Mexico Valley and the maize direct from Mexico, not eastern North America, but they took corn straight from Mexico, and they then started to grow it in France. And in France, they selectively bred the corn into the modern soft yellow corn that we have today. They put the seeds from Mexico into the ground in France, and they grew it, and it was a smash hit. In fact, here we can look at the diffusion of maize in North America, and I overlaid the dates of these sites. And we see it first travels up into the southwest US and also into the Rocky Mountains. Then around 1600 years later, it appears in Florida, and then it appears up in New York. And then there's looking at locations in the Ohio Valley. And the point is, it jumps from location to location, and the paper argues that maize actually spread from the Ohio Valley down into the Mississippi Valley. Now, Jared can probably cook up a just-so story about why maize grew in eastern Colorado before it was grown in Florida and Louisiana, despite Louisiana or even southeastern Texas being far closer and not having any mountains in the way, and also having a water route to the core maize production area in Mesoamerica. In fact, the story of corn in North America is a striking condemnation of Jared Diamond's thesis. Jared tries to frame it as some great ecological difficulty of maize going from the Mexico Valley up to the Mississippi Valley. No, honey, you have to explain why maize traveled to Colorado, almost to the border of Utah, around 1500 years before ever arriving in Florida. Forget where, according to Jared Diamond, it should have been, according to the sort of environmental determinist ecological explanation, it should have been first, the Mississippi Valley. No, it's going into the Rocky Mountains, and then it's going into freaking Florida, and then it's going up into New York, and then it's going into the Ohio Valley, and only then does it go into the Mississippi Valley. Why does all this happen? Why this incredible, like the Mississippi Valley is like the last place it ends up, which should be the first. Okay, this is a striking condemnation of everything Jared Diamond is saying. The answer to why all this happens, it just pops out at you. It's human action. It is man-made. The reason corn is first farmed in the Rocky Mountains is because the people there did it. It was human action, human choice, and human volition that decided these things. Either they traveled to Mexico or the Mesoamericans traveled to there. The people there just chose. They chose to farm corn while the people further east just didn't. The diffusion of maize into North America appears to have taken literally the most circuitous possible path before getting to the place most ecologically similar to the Mexico Valley, the Mississippi Valley. It appears to have been planted in mountains and deserts and then traveled around Florida and up to New York, near the border of Canada, before the Ohio Valley, and then finally down to the best place to grow corn in North America, the Mississippi Valley. You can't make this stuff up. If I were to propose that this is how maize actually diffused into North America, it would be laughed away like some sort of joke if we didn't know that this is how it actually happened. This is an almost cartoonishly comprehensive refutation of Jared Diamond's thesis here. Next, let's look at Jared's claim that the potato wasn't able to travel from the Andes to Mesoamerica. And this is from an old paper from 1968 by Donald Ugent entitled "The Potato in Mexico." And it says, quote, "It may very well be, as later suggested by Bukasov and Tox, that only a very limited amount of potato cultivation occurred in Mexico during the 16th century, which could account for its existence being overlooked by many early travelers. This latter theory is strengthened by the fact that the potato is an important native crop today only in the extreme upper agricultural zone of the central Mexican volcanic Cordillera. At lower elevations, the fertile upland valleys of Mexico, where maize, beans, and peppers have been grown continuously since ancient pre-Columbian times, the potato is currently only of minor importance and can be economically grown today only when protected from late blight by a regular and thorough spraying schedule." So Ugent is making the claim that Peruvian potatoes would have been very difficult to grow because they get blighted when they're grown in Mesoamerica, except for at the very high elevations, whereas potato land races native to Mesoamerica don't get blighted. And since in 1968 they were only grown at a very high elevations, they were probably only grown at very high elevations back then as well, if they were grown at all at the time of Columbus. And the fact is, Mexico has native land races of potato. And as far as we know, those civilizations made no attempt to cultivate these potatoes native to the Mexico area. And so the fact that there's not much evidence that potatoes from the Andes aren't grown in Mesoamerica doesn't mean it's a result of a lack of contact. We know that maize ended up being grown in the Incan civilization, so clearly in that instance a crop traveled from one region to another when it was deemed worthwhile to cultivate. Here's another part of Eugen's paper I found interesting. Quote, although there are no known indigenous Mexican potato epithets of pre-conquest origin, two highly questionable late 16th century Aztec names for the potato appear in the literature. These are Pelon Camote, or Peruvian sweet potato, or earth sweet potato. However, both putative names appear in the early literature without accompanying description or illustration and must therefore be cited only with caution. So maybe the Aztecs did on occasion grow potatoes from the Andes and knew that they came from that area. But there's also more evidence of interaction between Mesoamericans and Andean civilization. From David Cabrillo's Trade Routes in the Americas Before Columbus, he says, quote, most telling in this regard are the appearance of Andean metallurgical traditions in West Mexico and the presence of maize and Mexican hairless dogs in the northern coastal Andes. Depictions of Andean boats and painted ceramic vessels and other objects portray seaworthy vessels that show people and goods being shipped along the Pacific coast, close quote. What's also important to note is that the Aztecs actually had traders employed by the government to go north and south and trade things with people. The Aztec government literally paid people to get in boats and sail to various regions, including the Andean region, where the Inca Empire was, and buy stuff. The idea that Mesoamerican civilization didn't know about Andean civilizations just seems so far-fetched. They obviously knew somebody was there. I would also like to add that the Inca had probably traveled and raided the Galapagos Islands. From Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa's 1572 book, History of the Incas, he writes in section 46, marching and conquering on the coast of Manta and the island of Puna and Tumbez, they arrived at Tumbez, some merchants who had come by sea from the west, navigating in balsas with sails. They gave information of the land whence they came, which consisted of some islands called Avachumbi and Ninachumbi, where there were many people and much gold. Tupac Inca was a man of lofty and ambitious ideas and was not satisfied with the regions he had already conquered, so he determined to challenge a happy fortune and see if it would favor him by sea. Yet he did not lightly believe the navigating merchants, for such men, being great talkers, ought not to be credited too readily. In order to obtain fuller information, and as it was not a business of which news could easily be got, he called a man who accompanied him in his conquests, named Antarqui, who, they all declare, was a great necromancer and could even fly through the air. Tupac Inca asked him whether what the merchant mariners said was true. Antarqui answered, after having thought the matter well out, that what they said was true, and that he would go there first. They say that he accomplished this by his arts, traversed the new route, saw the islands, their people and riches, and returning, gave certain information of all to Tupac Inca. The Inca, having this certainty, determined to go there. He caused an immense number of balsas to be constructed, in which he embarked more than 20,000 chosen men, taking with him as captains a bunch of Inca names, his brother Tilca Yupanqui being general of the whole fleet. Apu Yupanqui was left in command of the army, which remained on land. Tupac Inca navigated and sailed on until he discovered the islands of Avachumbi and Ninachumbi, and returned, bringing back with him black people, gold, a chair of brass, and a skin and jawbone of a horse. These trophies were preserved in the fortress of Cuzco until the Spaniards came. An Inca now living had charge of this skin and jawbone of a horse. He gave this account, and the rest who were present corroborated it. His name is Urco Huaranca. I am particular about this because those who know anything of the Indies, it will appear strange and difficult to believe. The duration of the expedition undertaken by Tupac Inca was 9 months, others say a year, and as he was so long absent, everyone believed he was dead. But to deceive them and make them think that news of Tupac Inca had come, Apu Yupanqui, his general of the land army, made rejoicings. This was afterwards commented upon to his disadvantage, and it was said that he rejoiced because he was pleased that Tupac Inca Yupanqui did not appear. It cost him his life. These are the islands which I discovered in the South Sea on the 30th of November, 1567, 200 and more leagues to the westward, being the great discovery of which I gave notice to the licentiate Governor Castro. But Alvaro de Mendana, general of the fleet, did not wish to occupy them. So clearly Pedro believes this actually happened, and the Spanish discovered the Galapagos Islands later, and Pedro seems to think that these were in fact the islands that the Inca traveled to. Today, this is controversial, but at the time, this is just reported as something that just matter of fact happened. Unfortunately, Pedro doesn't mention any contact or any of the Inca talking to Mesoamericans. In fairness, he also only mentions merchants 3 times in the whole book, and my impression from skimming through the English translation is that it's mostly about the internal politics, the wars and power struggles within the Andean civilization, which extended from the tip of modern-day Ecuador down to the middle of Chile just south of Santiago. Another piece of evidence is to just look at a map. From Puerto Viejo, just heading due west, you hit the Galapagos in 591 miles. Now here's something to keep in mind. In a straight line, the distance from Talca to Quito is 2,478 miles. Now that's not the absolute north and south tips of the empire, but it's pretty close. The distance in a straight line from Acapulco to Quito is 1,861 miles. So the Inca were able to administer an empire of 2,478 miles, but weren't able to travel 1,861 miles? That they weren't able to travel outside of their lands a distance less than the extent of their lands? Now I get it, you could say it's open ocean, and it could be that the Inca were halted by the oceans, and once you get up into Colombia on land and into the jungle regions southwest of the Mexico basin, it becomes difficult to travel. Fair enough. Okay, well, hugging the coast, the distance from Puerto Viejo to Acapulco is 2,548 miles. So that's the real distance seafarers would probably be traveling from the Andean civilization to the Mesoamerican civilization, given that they probably weren't going to be traveling the whole distance in a straight line through open ocean. But hugging the coast from Puerto Viejo to Constitucion, which marks roughly the southern extent of the Inca Empire, that would be a distance of 2,790 miles. So either way you slice it, we are to believe the Andean peoples had no contact with the Mesoamerican peoples, despite the distance, either straight line or hugging the coast, between the two empires being less than the extent of the Inca Empire. Diamond also claimed that Montezuma believed Cortez was a god. Now, in a conversation recorded by Spanish onlookers transcribing what Montezuma's translator said, he quotes Montezuma as saying, quote, "For a long time we have known from the writings of our ancestors that neither I, Montezuma, nor any of those who dwell in this land are natives of it, but foreigners who came from very distant parts. And likewise we know that a chieftain, of whom they were all vassals, brought our people to this region. And he who returned to his native land and after many years came again, by which time all those who had remained were married to native women and had built villages and raised children. And when he wished to lead them away, again, they would not go nor even admit him as their chief, and so he departed. And we have always held that those who descended from him would come and conquer this land and take us as their vassals. So because of their place from which you claim to come, namely where the sun rises, and the things you tell us of the great lord or king who sent you here, we believe in a certain that he is our natural lord, especially as you say that he has known of us for some time. So be assured that we shall obey you and hold you as our lord in place of that great sovereign for whom you speak, and in this there shall be no offense or betrayal whatsoever. I know full well of all that has happened to you, from Putunchan to here, and I also know how those of Sempol and Tlaxcalteca have told you much evil of me. Believe only what you see with your eyes, for those are my enemies, and some were my vassals, and have rebelled against me at your coming, and said those things to gain favor with you. I also know that they have told you the walls of my house are made of gold, and that the floor mats of my rooms and many other things in my household are likewise of gold, and that I was, and claim to be a god, and many other things besides. The houses you see are of stone and lime and clay. See that I am flesh and blood like you, and all of the men, and I am mortal and substantial. See how they have lied to you? It is true that I have some pieces of gold left to me by my ancestor. Anything I might have shall be given to you whenever you ask. Now I shall go to other houses where I live, but here you shall be provided with all that you and your people require, and you shall receive no hurt, for you are in your own land and your own house." So Jared Diamond was wrong about Montezuma thinking Cortez was a god, wrong about there being no contact between Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations, and wrong about maize needing eons to adapt. Just wrong, wrong, wrong. On the case of Montezuma, the issue here was Montezuma trying to convince Cortez that he was not a god. That's what actually happened. Montezuma himself never considered Cortez to be a god. He then claims that several American crops were domesticated independently, and this independent domestication is supposedly the result of there being a lack of flow between regions, whereas Eurasian crops had much better flow between regions and that major staples were not independently domesticated on several locations. Jared Diamond says, quote, "On this basis, botanists conclude that lima beans, common beans, and chili peppers of the Capsicum Enoton, one Chinese group, or one Chinense group, were all domesticated on at least two separate occasions, once in Mesoamerica and once in South America, and that the squash, Cucumber de Pepo, and the seed plant goosefoot were all domesticated independently at least twice, once in Mesoamerica and once in the eastern United States. In contrast, most ancient Southwest Asian crops exhibit just one of the alternative wild variants, or alternative transforming mutations, suggesting that all modern varieties of that particular crop stem from only a single domestication." The problem with this is that we know that this is not true. We know that rice was domesticated from wild strains independently in at least two different regions, probably three. We also know that barley was independently domesticated, with the blue and red dots here representing separate domesticated, two separate domestication events. Well, I guess they just didn't have contact with each other, and so had to domesticate barley two separate times. Whereas in the Americas, because corn and sweet potatoes traveled better, they must have had more contact. And so they only had to domesticate it one time, right? See how stupid this is? See, I can pick and choose little events like this and tell all sorts of little stupid stories all day. You know, I can say that it was easier for sweet potatoes and for corn to travel because it was only domesticated in one location in the Americas, where here we have barley. It was more difficult to travel from these two regions within the Levant itself than it is to travel all the way from Mexico to the Andes. I mean, it's ridiculous. Right? The thing is, there's no relation here, right? There's separate domestication events because there were separate domestication events, and they grew the barley that was domesticated in this area versus that area because the people there just decided to do that, and the crops traveled or didn't travel from one region to another, partly because of geographic barriers, but also because of the choices of the people there at the time. We can also look at emmer wheat. And according to the paper, Reticulated Origin of Domesticated Emmer Wheat supports a dynamic model for the emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. These guys say that emmer was kind of domesticated in the Levant, and then those seeds traveled up to Turkey and Syria, were sown in the wild, and then at a later date, those people started growing wild emmer and picked up off the ground, and that wild emmer was actually the old emmer cultivated from the Levant. So here we have an episode where the crop actually traveled, but then wasn't used and so just grew in the wild, and then the people in the area didn't start farming it until later, until they made the decision to do so. So when Jared talks about the lack of flow of bean crops between the Andes and Mesoamerica as evidence of some natural barriers, well, why wasn't that the case for corn and sweet potatoes? You had sweet potatoes growing in the Andes and in Mesoamerica. You had corn growing in the Andes and Mesoamerica. Why did corn and sweet potatoes travel from region to region, but other crops didn't? Now, the idea of the Andean potatoes, or the normal potato we'll call it, not traveling is probably false. They probably did travel, and the various Mesoamerican civilizations didn't grow it because it didn't grow well in Mesoamerica, as we saw in that previous study. It got blighted in Mesoamerica. Even by the 1960s, growing regular potatoes in Mexico was very limited because they got blighted at lower elevations too easily. So just everything that Jared Diamond is saying about the ability of crops to travel, the north-south axis, just doesn't make any sense. I think I should rephrase that. The north-south axis sounds like something that is generally true. Again, I don't have any background or general knowledge of paleoagriculture, so I can't make some general statement about it being true. But it sounds true-ish to me. And as a starting point, it would make sense to imagine that maize and potatoes and sweet potatoes and the goosefoot pseudo-cereals, quinoa, amaranth, goosefoot, it would make sense to imagine that these crops wouldn't travel north-south in the Americas as well, just because of the shape of the continent, as opposed to rice and barley, which travel east-west. Not that barley even matters that much, but once you start doing specific investigations, these broad general ideas like the things traveling more easily east-west than north-south, which I'll just assume is true for now, these broad general ideas become irrelevant once you start doing specific investigations. And so if we lack specific information, fine, starting assumption, maize won't travel well. But we are way, way past starting assumptions here. And in specific, maize and potatoes, they spread north-south just fine. Now you, the viewer, you might also notice that most of the studies I'm citing are from after Guns, Germs, and Steel was written. And that may seem unfair or rude, or I should cut Jared some slack, or he was working with the best information he had. Well, Jared was pushing an agenda with that book, and he made a lot of claims before the necessary research on those topics was actually ever done. He wrote a big book, all right, and if he wrote a book describing these topics as being open and unsettled, that would be fine, but he didn't. He made clear claims of facts and smeared Europeans as privileged by geography, and he trivialized European accomplishment and ingenuity. He made a bunch of claims that were later proven to be wrong, debunking, basically, if you can think of it this way, debunking a privilege myth, debunking a series of privilege myths. But Jared Diamond takes it back to sort of a geographic, ecological privilege. And he hasn't acknowledged any of these studies that have refuted things that he has said, and he has made no apologies for what he has done. So don't shed a single tear for this guy. The independent domestication stuff doesn't make any sense. He says that rice was only domesticated one time when we know it was domesticated 3 times. Probably 3 times. Who knows? Maybe even more than that. He talks about, the crops in the Middle East only had to be domesticated one time, when we know that barley was domesticated at least twice independently, whereas corn and potatoes were only domesticated once. So does that mean that the Americas actually have an easier go of it because it's easier for crops to travel between Mexico and the Andes than it is from crops to travel from modern day Israel to Lebanon? Like, come on, like, this is a joke. This is where, like, these standards are ridiculous. They're not validated. Jared Diamond just doesn't know what he's talking about. Jared Diamond also likes to poo-poo the native grasses and grains in the eastern U.S. as not being conducive to civilization. He talks about the grasses like ragweed, sumpweed, little barley, and goosefoot, and as I was reading, I looked at the pictures he had of the wild grains just growing out in the wild in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, in the little pictures he had in the book. Now, when I was younger, I lived in Kansas, and I could have sworn I saw grasses like that just growing on the side of the road and out in backyards and stuff. And so I looked up little barley, and there it was. This stuff just grows everywhere. Jared, of course, claims that the ancient grasses / wild grains of the Middle East yield more than little barley. And I don't know, man. Little barley sure looks like the ancestor to wheat to me. It looks like wheat to me. I wasn't able to find any experiments growing little barley, but I was able to find 2 that grew goosefoot. One experiment from 1987 and one from 2017. Goosefoot is what is known as a pseudo-cereal, meaning that as far as humans growing it, it functions like a grain, and you roast the grains and you can grind it up and make goosefoot bread, but technically it's not a grain. Who cares? Functionally it is, even though technically it's not. So I decided to add the results from the 1987 and 2017 yields per hectare for goosefoot on my little chart here. And it seems to compare favorably with einkorn, and it seems to beat teosinte. Now, Jared Diamond doesn't cite any studies or any yield data showing einkorn to be better than little barley, and I wasn't able to find any either, so I don't know how little barley would stack up against einkorn or goosefoot in terms of yield per acre, but it looks like wheat to me. And here's what's actually going on. Jared imagines that the Eastern Agricultural Complex, or EAC crops, Eastern Agricultural Complex meaning the sort of the basket of crops that were grown by the advanced hunter-gatherers, pseudo-agriculturalists of the eastern United States, he believes that these are crap because the Native Americans never grew them and domesticated them to the degree that people in the Middle East did with their wild grains in the Middle East area. But of course, this is just circular reasoning. And he doesn't have yield tables, he doesn't show cultivation experiments, he just gives some utterly forgettable reason as to why grains in the eastern US can't grow. He talks about ragweed being an allergen, for example. And as I've shown with goosefoot and amaranth, does it have more or less inherent capacity were it selectively bred in the way einkorn was into modern wheat? I don't know, but neither does Jared. And today, quinoa grown in Peru yields about 1.929 million calories per acre, based on a simple calculation I did, which you can do yourself based on the labeled sources in the description on quinoa. So, okay, that's still quite a bit lower than wheat, but quinoa hasn't been selectively bred to the degree that wheat has, and it's more of a hippie food than a basic calorie staple crop. But is the ultimate genetic potential of, say, quinoa in terms of calories per acre lower than that of wheat? I don't know. It would take decades of attempts at selective breeding to see what you could get out of it. What we do know is that quinoa was bypassed in favor of potatoes and maize. And it's only when much of the world became food secure that quinoa started to generate interest as a hippie food. In fact, Jared Diamond himself goes some way to debunk this by pointing out how domesticable crops would only actually be domesticated in one area, and then the domesticated versions would then spread to other areas. For example, the natural range of einkorn, emmer, and barley extend through Asia Minor into the Balkans. However, they were farmed and initially selectively bred in the Fertile Crescent, and then those modified varieties later spread out of the Fertile Crescent into Asia Minor, Egypt, and eventually into the Balkans and into Italy and Spain, and ultimately into Europe itself. So even though these regions had access to those crops, the people just didn't grow them. And my explanation for this is actually somewhat similar to Jared Diamond's explanation, and it's also related to how I think states form. What determines if a population will go from hunter-gatherers to farmers has less to do with the actual value of farming, but with the relative value of farming. In the early civilizations, you had very fertile land, river valleys and mountain valleys, surrounded by either deserts or mountains. Now, ultimately, the total amount of farmland in Egypt is not very high. Europe ultimately had more farming potential, as we know. But because the limited arable land was some of the most fertile land on the planet and was constantly being irrigated, and the surrounds were deserts or very limited arable land on the North African coast, farming was relatively much better than hunting and gathering out in the deserts of Egypt. And so farming was relatively more valuable in Egypt than it was in Europe or the eastern United States. In the Americas, the eastern United States is certainly much better in terms of farming today than the Mexico Valley or the various mountain valleys in the Andes today. But the relative value of farming was much higher in the Mexico Valley and the Andean valleys, simply because you have the farming valleys and then you have rocks, you have mountains. So even though the eastern U.S. had better farmland overall, and probably, perhaps, I'm not sure, but probably even better concentrated ultra-fertile land in the Mississippi Valley itself, and so the northern Americans held on to hunting and gathering simply because hunting and gathering was so much more profitable, while the Mesoamericans and Andean peoples were forced into farming by the limited resources they would get from hunting and gathering. As a result, the first civilizations didn't come about in the regions of the planet that were broadly the most food resource rich, but they came about in these ultra-fertile river and mountain valleys surrounded by either deserts or mountains. What I just gave you is a just so story, something that explains why agriculture and states and people specializing in non-food producing jobs or civilization, why that occurred, where and when it did, and why it took longer to spread to areas that are more broadly suited to agriculture, though with less ultra-fertile land, i.e. there's nowhere in France that is acre for acre as good a farmland as the Nile Valley, as far as an ancient person is concerned. Well, okay. So let's make up a story as to why the first civilizations occurred in modern-day Central Asia. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Stanland. or I'll just say Tartary for convenience here. That wasn't the Nile River, that was some river in Stanland. Well, it's a bunch of desert, so hunting and gathering is unproductive, and you got these rivers in the desert. And the people congregated around the rivers and started farming. Started farming what? Oh, they started farming the wild grains. Now, if you were to say there were no wild grains suitable for cultivation and eventual domestication like there were in the Fertile Crescent, well, you don't know that. Maybe there are even more and better candidates than there were in the Fertile Crescent. I mean, just looking at a map, I would suspect so, given the proximity of the Russian Far East and all of the grasses in that region, just east of the Urals. Certainly we would expect some grass that could be cultivable as a grain, and this region isn't hemmed in like the Fertile Crescent is, so one would guess it would have easier access to grasses up north that could be brought in and used as grains. Jared brings up all these ancient domesticated crops that were grown in the Fertile Crescent, but that doesn't mean the area had more ecological potential at the start, just that humans acted and evolved new crops through selective breeding in one area but not another. And we can imagine that the central location of Central Asia made it an important trading hub, with access straight into China through the mountain valleys of Xinjiang, which themselves may be home to a mountain valley civilization similar to the Andean or Mexico Valley civilizations, or similar to the Indus Valley civilizations. With horsemen carrying goods from Central Asia through the Caspian to Persia, over the steppe to the Volga peoples, down through Afghanistan and into the Indus Valley. All this could have happened, and then historians would look back on it and say that it was inevitable, that Tartary was destined to be the first location of civilization by dint of its location and its river valleys circumscribed by deserts, forcing people into farming very early. And this was also inevitable because of constant influxes of new people due to Tartary's central location within Eurasia. And people would come in unfamiliar with local plant and animal life, competing with other hunter-gatherers, and they were forced into farming just to survive. And given these factors, of course it's inevitable that this would be where the first large-scale farming inevitably started, leading to the first well-known cities that we know today: Samarkand, Tashkent. And then we would explain why the earliest farming didn't occur in Mesopotamia or Egypt by pointing out how far these places were from the center of Eurasia. They were somewhat peripheral. They were over down in here in sort of the cracks. Of course, civilization isn't going to start in Egypt or Mesopotamia, you could say. They're separated by bodies of water, by the Arabian Desert to the south, the mountains of Persia, Asia Minor and the Caucasus. They were blocked off from the Ukraine and the Volga area. They were blocked off from what is modern-day Russia. So it was isolated. It was an isolated peripheral region, not connected to the world island in the way Tartary was, so we could say. But since the first mass farming and civilization did in fact occur in Mesopotamia, we say that's the cradle of civilization, and historians and anthropologists tell us how inevitable it was and had nothing to do with specific volitional human action, right? Just look at a map, they'll say. River valleys circumscribed by deserts. Look at how its central location gives it sea access to India, to the Mediterranean, and can even follow the Danube and Dnieper and Volga rivers up to trade into the heart of Europe. Blah, blah, blah. Just so stories without any coherent methodology, or a pseudo-methodology invented after the fact that merely explains what we already know happened. And you could do this storytelling for things that happened and things that didn't happen with roughly equal surface level plausibility. And sometimes, quite humorously, Jared gets it wrong, claiming barley wasn't independently domesticated but all came from a single strain, and this is because of the greater flow and interconnectedness of the Fertile Crescent region. Now I found out later, after Guns, Germs, and Steel was published, that this isn't true, but that doesn't stop Jared Diamond from having a story about it, or the same with rice. Jared points out how rice had a single domestication event and spread from there, which is explained by the greater travel of crops in Eurasia, the greater interconnectedness. It wasn't isolated and segmented, and so it was easier for Eurasia to develop, according to Jared Diamond. Of course, we now know that there were actually 2, maybe 3 independent domestications of rice, but that doesn't stop Jared from having a perfectly plausible explanation for why there was only 1 founding domestication of rice. The event doesn't have to have happened for Jared Diamond to have an explanation of it. True or false, Jared Diamond will find a way to explain whatever he wants. Now, I don't have the programming skills to make a program for this thought experiment, but just imagine kind of a flatland, a 25 by 25 square grid. Each square represents a plot of land. And say in one generation, each square has a 1% chance to move up a level on this scale here, from pure hunting and gathering to, unattended seed planting, to 25% farming, to 50% farming, to 90% farming, to advanced farming with irrigation and crop rotation, right? We have different levels of moving up into agriculture and civilization. Now, when one square goes up a level, the surrounding squares now have a 1% higher chance of going up a level, which means it goes from having a 1% chance of moving up a level to a 2% chance of moving up a level every turn. So if one square is at level 1, the surrounding squares are all at level 0, those squares now have a 2% chance of leveling up as opposed to a 1% chance of leveling up. And if one square is at level 2 and the surrounding squares are at level 0, then those squares now have a 3% chance of leveling up. Right, do you see how this works? And the result of this would be that by pure chance, by the randomness and vagaries of human action, some squares would be the first to have farming, and the surrounding squares would then be more likely to adopt farming, thus creating little cluster patterns of farming. Now, if you run the simulation long enough, all squares would end up being maximally farmed, which doesn't happen in the real world. But even in this situation where every square has an identical probability to begin farming, you would see clusters of farming in certain regions on the board. And that's something that's important to recognize. Now, it's just a thought experiment. It's not meant to completely accurately reflect reality, obviously, but it's just a caution against reading too much into patterns that you think you see. Because even in a completely flat, random system, patterns will emerge. And don't be the guy who looks at Flatland here and comes up with all sorts of reasons why it was inevitable that farming was going to start on this square and then radiate out from this square. And they would say, after all, look at all the domesticated grains they had here, and look at all how it was interconnected with all the other farming areas. Like, don't be that guy. I understand in the real world, it's not flat land. There's all sorts of terrain variability. Certainly, we see a pattern of the earliest farming occurring in circumscribed river valleys and mountain valleys that are surrounded by otherwise desolate deserts and mountains. That's where the first farming tended to occur. So there seems to be some sort of causal relation there. I'm not discounting that completely, but I'm also cautioning against overfitting and reading too much into what actually happened as being somehow inevitable and ignoring any vagaries in human action. Sorghum. Yield estimates for sorghum are all over the place, from 50 to 98 to 200 bushels per acre. Sorghum is about 50 pounds per bushel, 632 calories per 192 grams, 1493 calories per pound. So about 7.316 million calories per acre of sorghum grown today, from sorghum grown today. So just going with 98 bushels per acre, sorghum grown in the US seems pretty efficient as a calorie crop. And a type of sorghum grew wild all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope. Of course, a high modern yield doesn't necessarily mean that the yields in 1800 were viable, but is probably a good indicator. So when Diamond claims that the Xhosa didn't have crops that could grow as far down as the Cape area, well, they went down as far as this. Does Jared Diamond think going down this little bit farther would make their crops not work, even though their crops apparently did work just fine within the Xhosa kingdom? Diamond claims the crops couldn't transplant across areas because of summer versus winter rain, saying, quote, "However, figure 19.1 of recent African human distributions reminds us that the Bantu did not overrun all the Khoisan, who did survive in southern African areas unsuitable for Bantu agriculture. The southernmost Bantu people, the Xhosa, were stopped at the Fish River on South Africa's south coast, 500 miles east of Cape Town. It's not that the Cape of Good Hope itself is too dry for agriculture. It is, after all, the breadbasket of modern South Africa. Instead, the Cape has a Mediterranean climate of winter rains in which the Bantu southern rain crops do not grow. By 1652, the year the Dutch arrived at Cape Town, with their winter rain crops of Near Eastern origin, the Xhosa still had not spread beyond the Fish River," close quote. I read this and I'm just thinking, I don't know, man. They grow modern wheat in West Africa and around the Cape area. They grow sorghum in West Africa and in the Cape area today. This summer versus winter rains thing just sounds like a thing you're saying. Here's a paper showing land races of sorghum in South Africa, and there's a bunch around the Cape area. I feel like I need to say more about this, but this is a case of Jared Diamond says A, and well, not A. He's just wrong about this, and it's QED by the fact that sorghum is in fact farmed at the Western Cape just fine, and wheat is grown in parts of Africa where they have the winter rains or the summer rains or whatever the wrong rains supposedly are for wheat. This point is just profoundly dumb and basically wrong. There's not really anything more to say. I mean, maybe I should do a little dance. Maybe I should do the Jared Diamond is wrong dance. He's wrong in a way where it just seems like he didn't even look this up. One thing that really caught my eye was Jared Diamond's treatment of the Bantu expansion. He says, quote, "The first Bantu pioneers probably were few in number, selected wet forest areas suitable for their yam agriculture, and leapfrogged over drier areas, which they left to Khoisan herders and hunter-gatherers. Trading and marriage relationships were undoubtedly established between the Khoisan and the Bantu farmers, each occupying different adjacent habitats, just as pygmy hunter-gatherers and Bantu farmers still do today in equatorial Africa." Kind of. To the extent that the pygmies even exist. Anyway, continuing. "Only gradually, as the Bantu multiplied and incorporated cattle and dry climate cereals into their economy, did they fill in the leapfrogged areas. But the eventual result was still the same. Bantu farmers occupying most of the former Khoisan realm, the legacy of those former Khoisan inhabitants reduced to cliques in scattered non-Khoisan languages, as well as buried skulls and stone tools waiting for archaeologists to discover, and the Khoisan-like appearance of some southern African Bantu peoples. Maybe arguable on that last point. Now, when I read this, I checked to see if Jared Diamond was Jewish, and he is. When historians lie about a kind of harmony and unity and coexistence among non-Europeans, and then turn around and inflame and create monstrous caricatures of white men as genociders and exploiters, it seems clear to me what they're doing. Because we know that the Bantu expansion, we know today, this is well established, that the Bantu expansion was an exterminationist expansion. The Bantu, which is what in the US we just call like black people, there's actually very different looking black people, right? There's the Khoisans, and another term for the East Africans would be the Hamites, and of course there were the Pygmies, these tiny black people. These people were straight up exterminated, and the Bantus exterminated the Khoi and the Pygmy peoples all throughout Africa, whose remains have been found since Jared wrote his book, and what we now know is that there's almost no significant racial mixture between the two. The Bantu genome is relatively pure, which points to signs of extermination, and what admixture there is evidence of Khoi mothers. That is, it's Bantu males and Khoi females, which historically that is a sign of rape and conquest. And if the Bantus were just peacefully integrating and intermarrying with all of these groups, why didn't they do that with the East Africans? It looks more to me that the East Africans were militarily proficient enough to not be overrun by the Bantus. And this is something that Jared Diamond points out in his book. He talks about how the Bantus weren't able to overrun East Africa because the East Africans had cattle and they had better farming techniques. Well, what would that matter if the Bantus were just coming in and integrating with these people? Why wouldn't the Bantu just go into Kenya and Tanzania and Ethiopia and just admix with those people like they supposedly did with the Pygmy and the Khoisan? And the answer, of course, is that's not what the Bantus were doing. The Bantus were expanding militaristically, they were exterminating peoples, and they weren't able to do that with the East Africans, and that's why they were stopped. If the Bantus were just peacefully integrating with all these other African peoples, then the greater technological proficiency of the East Africans wouldn't have mattered. They only would have been stopped if the Bantu expansion was a militaristic style expansion, which we basically know it was. In tracing the Bantu expansion, Jared says the Bantu picked up crops around the Sahel region, Then, when they got to East Africa, they picked up cattle from the Nilotic peoples, or Hamitic peoples, whatever term you want to use for East African. And while the Bantu weren't able to impress upon the Nilots, which is why to this day East Africans are physiologically so much different than West and Central Africans, they're the skinny ones, the Bantus then turned south. But if the Nilots had both grain crops and cattle, why aren't we talking about a Nilot expansion? With the advantages of cattle, why isn't the story about the Nilots taking over the bulk of Africa? Again, it's another one of these just so stories about the Bantu expansion, which actually happened, but then Jared doesn't seem to be concerned about why the East Africans didn't expand in the way the Bantus did, who appear to have everything that the Bantus did, plus cattle, and they didn't bother expanding south and west to anything like the degree to which the Bantus did. Now, after working on this for as long as I have developed a kind of clairvoyance. I know what Jared would say on this. He would point to some difference between what the Bantus had and what the Nilots had and chalk up the difference in behavior to the Bantus having this crop over that crop or something. He would find something. He would say, well, the Bantu grew sorghum, the Ethiopians didn't, right? Because every population on the planet, in addition to being different genetically, had at the time different crops and animals that they were using. And so he could find some, there's enough variation in human populations and everything that they're doing that you can always latch onto something. You can always find some difference and say, this is why the difference in behavior. It doesn't matter if it has any causal connection or not. You can always just say that, and it's really difficult to falsify. Jared Diamond brings up how the Bantu weren't all the way down at the Cape itself when the Portuguese and the Dutch and the English started showing up, as evidence that the Bantu couldn't expand because their crops didn't work further south. Well, their crops not working as they moved further south, this is pure speculation. And it's probably wrong because South Africa grows a ton of crops and none of them appear to have any issue with summer or winter rains or whatever Jared Diamond is just babbling about here. And certainly the wild native growing sorghum in the region didn't have any problems with the wrong season of the rains or whatever Jared Diamond thinks is going on. And so Diamond claims that the Xhosa couldn't expand all the way down to the Cape because it was too far south and the crops couldn't grow because the rains were wrong. But the Xhosa did in fact get all the way down here, and we know a land race of wild sorghum grew all the way down to the Cape. Now, the issue here is just serendipity. If the Bantu could push all the way to the Cape, why didn't they? And one answer I see is that they were just in the process of doing so, and the British and the Europeans just showed up just in time to meet the Bantu, or Xhosa and Zulu, as they were specifically called after the dominant tribes, and they just sort of arrived right as this was still going on. Now, you could respond to this explanation that I have as like, oh, how convenient that they just so happened to be, that the Europeans just so happened to catch the region as it was being taken over by the Bantus, but wasn't completely being taken over by the Bantus, that the British just landed in a place that just so happened to be right in the path of the final stages of the Bantu expansion. And I agree, that is serendipitous, but so what? When the Spaniards arrived in Mesoamerica, they caught the region on the Aztecs. They came into the area when the Aztecs were in power. And the Aztecs were a particularly weak regime that terrorized and took human sacrifices from other tribes. This resulted in the other tribes hating the Aztecs, and it was very easy to animate them against the Aztecs, and thus the Aztecs were easy to overthrow. The Mexico area, which then later became New Spain, wasn't so much conquered as a revolution was spearheaded by a Spanish vanguard who then placed themselves at the top of a kind of revolutionary council, basically, with fealty to the Spanish crown. And what a coincidence that was. How lucky that was, how convenient that was, and yet, yeah, that's sort of what happened, and things like this can happen. The British could land in South Africa in the process of the Bantu expansion as it's going on but not being complete. You wouldn't expect it, but it's certainly something that is allowed to be. I understand that the coincidence does raise eyebrows, but coincidences happen, and Jared's babbling about how Bantu crops couldn't grow around the Cape area when the Xhosa were obviously growing something in the eastern part of the Cape area. We know wild sorghum grew in that area. Jared's ecological explanation here is just not compelling at all. And let's say the Xhosa did in fact stall out at the Fish River for an anomalously long time period. If you, without this reference frame of crops and rainfall or whatever, if you were just looking for an explanation for why the Bantu expansion stopped at the Fish River for 100 years or however long they stopped, would you not look at that and say that it was caused by the internal political machinations of the Xhosa? Or maybe a string of Xhosa leaders came to an arrangement with the Khoisan on the other side, and so to expand further would break both an external treaty and their own traditions. Or perhaps there was infighting within the Xhosa. I don't know. But there are more explanations for this kind of stuff, especially when dealing with state actions. I mean, when talking, for example, about the Great Trek of the Dutch from the Cape up into the middle of modern-day South Africa and the formations of Orange and Transvaal, we have political explanations for that. We don't immediately jump to, oh, they moved up there because they had this kind of crop that could grow there or something. No, the reasons were political. It had to do with the British coming in and, in a sense, subjugating the Dutch. The Dutch didn't want to be subjugated, so they did the Great Trek up north. So, on why the Bantus hadn't pushed all the way down to the Cape by the time the British showed up, Jared Diamond's ecological explanation is neither compelling nor needed. So one of the big claims Jared likes to make is that Africa and the Americas didn't have any kind of equivalent to the old world horses and cattle. Well, let's start with zebras. So they're all throughout East Africa and some in South Africa. And there's an interesting book by Matthew Horace Hayes entitled The Points of the Horse, a familiar treatise on equine conformation, and it talks about various horses and asses. And in the chapter entitled The Points of the Ass, he talks about zebras, where he says, quote, "As the Burchell zebra is comparatively easy to break in, and as it will in time become domesticated, if, as is quite possible, it possesses little to no tendency to contract horse sickness, it will prove a valuable means of conveyance in South Africa. During one of my horse-breaking performances in 1892 at Pretoria, the capital of Transvaal, I made a young Burchell zebra, after about an hour's handling, quiet to carry a rider. In doing this, I did not throw the animal down, nor did I resort to any of the usual heroic horse taming methods. Throughout South Africa, this variety of zebra is wrongly called the quagga. In the year 1891 at Calcutta, I broke in, after 2 days training, an old and tired zebra, quiet enough for my wife to ride and to get photographed while on its back. This was certainly the first time a lady has ridden this variety of zebra, which has a reputation all over the world of being unrideable. Although I made many inquiries on the subject while I was in South Africa, I could not obtain a single authenticated case of anyone in that country ever having ridden a mountain zebra. With the advantage of the special instruction in horse breaking, which I gave during my tour through South Africa in 1892, the residents of that country ought to experience no difficulty in getting any zebra, which they may have in captivity, broken to either harness or saddle. The height of the mountain zebra, when full grown, is about 12 hands. Important to add that at the end. 12 hands. Okay. One strange line I hear on the internet is that, sure, zebras can be tamed, but it's not practical to do so. And when you consider whether something is practical, it always has to be compared to something else. Sure, compared to modern, selectively bred, domesticated breeds of modern horses, zebras are impractical. And once the tsetse fly was dealt with, there's really no point to use archaic horses like zebras, onagers, or tarpans once you have these larger, faster, and more docile, conformed breeds of modern horses. They're bigger, they have more power, and they're easier to tame. Although they're not inherently tame, they do have to be broken. Even modern horses do. Now, Germans in East Africa during World War I used zebras as cavalry and to carry supplies. So clearly zebras weren't impractical when compared to the alternative of having nothing at all. When the option was zebras or no horse, the Germans chose zebras. Sure, I'm sure the zebras were inferior, and I'm sure they would have preferred to have modern, domesticated, and selectively bred horses, but the zebras were tamed, and they were useful in a military context. As an aside, the ancestors of modern horses, which were smaller and shorter, like zebras, are now believed to have had stripes, like zebras. And the stripes of the archaic ancestors to modern horses went away as they were selectively bred. One thing that's bizarre is looking around the internet where people write about zebras and they all just kind of meme that zebras either can't be tamed or they can, but it's impractical. And they just say this. They usually don't even make the case that zebras are more difficult to tame than tarpans or archaic horses were, because they're usually not even considering that. They're just thinking about zebra versus modern horses and how much more difficult and aggressive zebras are than our modern horses. But that's not the relevant comparison, because when Homo sap started marching up into Europe and into Russia and Central Asia, they didn't have modern, fully domesticated horses. They had short, little stumpy things that would bite you if you got too close. And sometimes, to their credit, they will show the German zebra cavalry, but I guess by showing these pictures of the German zebra cavalry, they're showing that it's not relevant? Maybe it's kind of like they're going in before someone brings up German zebra cavalry, like they say, yeah, zebras can't be made useful for work in any consistent manner, but in before this slam dunk example of zebras being used for useful things in a whole military campaign. And you can't use this argument of the German zebra cavalry because I in before'd it. It's like, well, no, I think the fact that the Germans actually tamed and used zebras for transport and transporting supplies in a military context is quite a clear slam dunk example of zebras being tameable and practically useful when there's no other options. I think this basically blows it out of the water, and I guess they'll just go, well, no, you can't use that example because I in before'd it. In before. So maybe that's sort of the reason why. But I don't even think that people are even thinking that far. I think it's more like they've heard that zebras can't be used as draft animals. They maybe heard their social studies teacher mention it in a comment offhand or something. But then there's this zebra cavalry thing staring them in the face. And most people aren't critical thinkers, so they just sort of try to construct a world where, there was zebra cavalry and zebra being used for transport in a military context, but also zebras can't be used in any useful way and never could have been tamed by Africans, right? I guess they're just sort of trying to make both things work instead of going, well, maybe your social science teacher was wrong. But see, I know where this stupid meme comes from. I know that this meme that zebras can't be tamed or made useful, it comes from a guy who's wrong about a lot of stuff and a guy who doesn't cite sources and doesn't have a coherent methodology. And from what we have seen about the domestication of foxes, not just taming, but then the later domestication of foxes, basically any animal is domesticable. If it can be tamed, if it can be held in captivity and then bred in captivity, there's no reason to believe that the zebra cannot be domesticated. That, I guess, what would you be saying if you don't think the zebra is domesticable like the tarpan was? I guess you're just making this claim that the zebra just doesn't have the genetic variation to be selectively bred to become larger and more docile like the modern horses. I mean, the zebra, it looks just like archaic horses. It looks just like the old tarpans. It looks just like the old Przewalski horse or whatever. It looks just like those things. It acts just like those things. It can be tamed and broken in the same way a modern horse is. It's a little bit more work, but it's the same basic process to break in a zebra as it is to break in a modern horse. I mean, this idea, it's just goofy. This idea that the zebra can't be domesticated. And I suspect some English explorers went to East Africa and asked why the East Africans weren't using the zebras, and the black people there, the black-skinned people, the Nilots there, said, well, we just can't do it. It's untamable or whatever. And so this sort of myth perhaps permeated that the zebra's untamable, even though in 1892 you had this guy running around Africa taming zebras and putting on demonstrations. Here's how you tame zebras pretty easily. And then the Germans in World War I tamed hundreds of them to carry their munitions around East Africa during the war. It's just such a bizarre thing, this belief that zebras are either can't be tamed, or they can be tamed but they can't then be domesticated, or it's really, really hard. It's just bizarre. And I think it's just I think what's really happening here is Jared Diamond and people who want to believe what Jared Diamond is saying are looking for a reason why the black people in East Africa did not utilize the zebra in the way that the white people, and in anthropological terms, Mongoloid peoples, were able to tame and domesticate the horses in their areas, and whereas the East Africans, the black-skinned people, were not. That's what this is about. And so they're constructing this goofy idea that the zebra can't be used in the same way. The next question is the obvious North American analog of the cow, the bison. Now, this is a somewhat difficult question because modern cows and zebus were selectively bred to be more docile and conform to humans over a long period of time. So really, we're talking about aurochs, or wild cows. And if we want to ask whether or not North America had an advantage or disadvantage regarding domesticatable animals, we need to find a way to compare the bison to not the modern day cow or zebu, but to the auroch. The problem is the auroch, from which the modern cow was selectively bred from, doesn't exist anymore, and all we have are accounts. So how do aurochs compare to bison? Well, Caesar describes the aurochs he encountered in Gaul, modern-day France, between 58 and 50 BC. He says, quote, "There is a third kind, consisting of those animals which are called uri," aurochs. "These are a little below the elephant in size," elephant referring to an extinct variety of North African elephant, "and of the appearance, color, and shape of a bull. Their strength and speed are extraordinary. They spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied. These the Germans take with much pains in pits and kill them. The young men harden themselves with this exercise and practice themselves in this kind of hunting, and those who have slain the greatest number of them have produced the horns in public to serve as evidence, receive great praise. But not even when taken very young can they be rendered familiar to men and tamed. The size, shape, and appearance of their horns differ much from the horns of our oxen. These they anxiously seek after, and bind at the tips with silver, and use as cups at their most sumptuous entertainments." Now, Caesar, when describing these animals, was not aware that these uri were actually the predecessors of modern domesticated cattle that they had in Latium itself. Caesar was probably referring to the North African elephant, not the Asian or Sub-Saharan African elephant, which are both larger. The North African elephant, of course, is extinct, but it was the North African elephant. It was a much smaller variety of elephant that Hannibal used, and so it's a more reasonable thing for him to say. Credits to the blog Hide and Rug for this picture and the finding of the relevant passage from Caesar's accounts of his campaign in Gaul. So Caesar says the auroch attack, but they can also be tamed. Well, there are bison ranches today. Wild bison kill people and flip them up in the air, just like the accounts of aurochs, but bison can also be tamed, just like aurochs. As for workload, well, the buffalo are more powerful than modern oxen overall, but pound for pound, they're less powerful than oxen. But this is in their wild state. If they were selectively bred, perhaps bison would become cowed and even become more compliant, and as a result work harder as a draft animal. Certainly there's no reason to believe bison are inherently any more dangerous than aurochs were. Aurochs were generally agreed to have gone extinct around 1600 AD. In terms of size, the aurochs weighed between 1,500 and 3,300 pounds, depending on breed and location, and the North American bison ranged from around 800 pounds in a small female to 2,200 pounds in a large male. I mean, this size difference between the auroch and the bison probably didn't matter that much because humans, they're not able to physically overpower either the bison or the auroch, and they weren't able to physically overpower horses or cattle or elephants when they tamed them, obviously. So I'm not sure how much the size difference really even matters, but I'm saying this just in case people imagine that the bison were physically larger than the aurochs were, when the aurochs were probably larger, inferring from the skeletal remains at least. So, and from the accounts of the auroch. So again, this is not something that we can say for certain, but we can say for certain that bison have been tamed, and there are bison ranches, and there are little bison ranches where they take children in and the children feed corn to the bison, when I just watching videos of bison moving around and their little micro actions, how they chew the grass, how they bite stuff, how they walk around, how they sway and move. They very much look like cows. I mean, they're not cows. They're different from cows, but they're very clearly similar to cows. Kind of like when you watch a zebra moving around, it's like, that's a horse. It moves like a horse, right? And same with a bison. It kind of moves like a cow. So was the auroch more or less aggressive and violent than the North American bison? There's no way to tell. But what we can tell is that the bison is certainly tameable. It can be bred in captivity. It's domesticable. Jared Diamond also argues that the Americas lacked good draft animals. And further south, we look at the llamas, and we look at its goofy neck, and it spits on things, and we go, that can't be a draft animal. And sure, when looking at it, I suspect it would make a poor draft animal. But let's perhaps be more scientific about this. I found this paper, Animal Traction, Guidelines for Utilization, that has a very useful table. It posts the average weight, loaded speed, average load, and maximum load for various animals. And we can get a quantified measure of how valuable various animals are as draft animals. So I have the results here for average and maximum load, speed under load. And with these, we can look at the value of various animals as transport animals. And we can see that llamas and dogs are really good transport animals. Dogs, of course, may be a bit unwieldy, given that they're dogs and that they can't graze, and that their diet and their required diet is fairly expensive. You need to be feeding a dog meat if you're going to have it work that hard. However, when the ability to graze is not a factor, such as up in Arctic regions, dogs were used quite a bit, since their disadvantage of being unable to graze was shared by any potential draft animal. So they'd hook up a bunch of dogs to a sled and off they went. Eskimos would do this, and so did Europeans when they started to settle Alaska. But then I look here, and llamas actually look pretty good. They're similar to camels, which were also used to carry people and things over long distances. Which makes sense because llamas and camels are apparently genetically related and similar. When saying that the Americas lacked pack animals, well, llamas look pretty good here. And from what I've seen of llama ranchers, they look trainable. And on these matters, I just don't see the experimentation needed to establish common claims. How much can a llama pull? How much ground of a certain type can a llama plow? And what's the calorie cost per acre for a llama compared to what we think the first aurochs cost? So no, llamas look fine. Now today, farmers ended up using horses, and we can speculate as to why farmers in North America preferred to use horses and didn't import llamas from South America. There's all sorts of reasons that could be that have nothing to do with the relative efficiency of the animals. And even if you want to say, well, farmers in North America used horses because they were more docile than llamas, well, that's a good point, but that could just be a function of the horses having been domesticated from the tarpans. If llamas were to be selectively bred to the degree that horses were, there's a chance that llamas could become larger and more docile and far more effective as draft animals than even modern horses are. Looking at llamas as they exist now, in a semi-wild state, in a semi-undomesticated state, they seem pretty tame as they are now, certainly tameable, and I just don't see evidence that this is some sort of really poor draft animal. I don't think that the Americas lacked draft animals. So I did a lot of what I wanted to do in this video, and that is to deal with Diamond on some of the key empirical claims that he made, which have been, I think, clearly shown to be false, and several more questionable. This is something that was lacking in the praises and critiques of Guns, Germs, and Steel, any critical analysis of the actual claims he was making. And it took time, but not as much time as I thought it would. And Jared is actually straightforwardly wrong on a lot of stuff he says if you actually listen to the arguments. The one thing I'm noticing over time is that people are increasingly just not listening to arguments. and that younger people, despite having the internet, have a far more authoritarian view of knowledge than people who did not grow up with the internet. And that is a very, very depressing thing. Jared Diamond, who has a PhD in something, whether it's even relevant to what he's writing about, who knows? I couldn't be arsed to even look it up as I was sort of recording this extemporaneous end here. So let's start with some of the dumb stuff Jared says. Jared repeats this blood libel that the Americas had 20 million people in North America and 95% of them were killed off by Europeans. In 1776, the US had a population of around 2.5 million. Now, granted, that was clustered on the East Coast, but if North America had 20 million people before Columbus, then we would expect the areas that made up the 13 original colonies to have around 5.37 million people in them, or well over twice as many white people as there were in 1776. That, however densely populated the United States was in 1776, according to Jared Diamond, the pre-Columbian population of the East Coast was of that same area was twice as much, according to Jared Diamond. Or that would be the implication of a population of 20 million throughout the whole of North America. If you say the population of the U.S. is skewed eastward today due to historical settlement patterns, fine, have that. Jared Diamond would still be saying that there would be about as many Siberian Americans in 1500 in the 13 colonies as there were European Americans in the 13 colonies in 1776. And despite this, when Europeans arrived in North America, they would arrive on the shore, and sometimes they would see an Amerindian straight away, but sometimes it could take a week before a hunter-gatherer party spotted them, because the way hunter-gatherers actually worked is they cycled through their territory. They didn't stay in one area for months on end. They would go to one area and they would set up camps in multiple areas. And these separate and multiple camps actually led to historians overcounting the population because they imagined these camps were continuously settled when actually they were settled in rotation. But anyway, during the Revolutionary War in 1776, when the British landed on the coast in the US, they would be spotted by someone immediately. And this was in a country with less people than Jared Diamond believed there were in the Americas when the Europeans first showed up. And on top of this, we also know roughly how much the Native American population fell across the whole continent. And it was about 50%. And apparently they can look at the genetic diversity of mitochondrial DNA, and they can basically measure population expansions and contractions from that. But the collapse only lasted about 100 years. But around 1600, the Amerindian populations actually started to increase again, and the Native American populations actually fully recovered by the mid-1800s. I also mapped other known advanced hunter-gatherer populations onto North America, and I came up with 3.5 million for North America as the population of North America pre-Columbus. And a study by Milner and Chaplin that I went over in an article on this said that the old 20 million number comes from treating all Native American settlements as if they were permanently inhabited, when in reality, these were sites that tribes would move to in cycles. And in fact, this is something well known from the old world. When you have hunter-gatherer populations, they set up multiple camps and they cycle through the camps. They don't stay at one location. And by simply counting the number of camps appropriately, based on what we know historically studied hunter-gatherer populations, Milner and Chaplin come up with a number lower than mine, less than 2 million in fact. And Milner and Chaplin go into a bunch of detail about how they estimate the rate of use of various sites, but they get a number of around 1.6 million. So if you think I'm rough with my 3.5 million number, honey, I'm being generous. I'm actually being a nice guy with my assumptions regarding the carrying capacity of the eastern United States for advanced hunter-gatherers. But ultimately, if you come up with a method that says there were even 10 million people in North America pre-Columbus, you did something wrong. Because if there were 2.5 million people in the 13 colonies in 1776, and the U.S. East Coast makes up about 20% of the population of North America, which includes Canada, then the population of the whole of North America would be around 10 million if it were as relatively densely populated as the U.S. East Coast in 1776 as it is to today. You go ahead and replay that sentence if it's a little bit difficult to understand. I'm saying if the relative distribution of the population of North America was the same then as it is today, with a higher concentration on the East Coast being about 20% of the population of the whole of North America, which we would expect given the quality of the land, and the whole of the population of North America was 10 million, we would expect around 2.5 million on the U.S. East Coast in 1500, right? Upon first contact, which would be about the same population density as existed in the 13 colonies in 1776. At 2.5 million people, when we know there were about that many people when the U.S. first declared independence, you had ports, you had plantations, you had small towns, you had things which at the time were called cities. You had paved roads. You had multi-story buildings. When Europeans showed up on the U.S. East Coast, they could just move in and start farming because the land wasn't being used. As another question, how was a population of 2.5 million people being sustained? Europeans could only sustain a population that large by farming. How were the Native Americans sustaining a population that large just on the U.S. East Coast by mostly hunting and gathering and by having a bunch of forests around, right? And so the Europeans would move in, they would just move in and start farming, and then they would deal with the occasional nuisance raid by the Siberian Americans. Now, by nuisance, I mean not that they weren't lethal, obviously were, but just that the raids by the Ojibwa, for example, never posed an existential threat to European civilization in North America. On a civilizational scale, they were a nuisance, nothing more. Compare this to when Cortez showed up in Mesoamerica, or when Pizarro went down into the Inca realms. They started seeing people and settlements immediately, and they fought large-scale, old-world-style battles against large conscript armies. Okay, that's what a civilization with millions of people looks like. That's what dealing with a civilization with millions of people actually looks like, right? You have big mass armies with tens of thousands in big battles, right? You didn't have that with the Americas. The most you had was like, Custer's Last Stand with like 600 people or something. It was not comparable at all. There was a very clear difference in how Mesoamerica and South America were described and treated versus how North America was described and treated. If there were 20 million people in North America, then there would be descriptions of cities, of ports, of plantations, and there would be battles with armies in the tens of thousands. All of those things were done to describe Mesoamerica and were done to describe the Andean civilization. If North America did in fact have this many people, they would have had to have that kind of stuff to sustain that population. They couldn't all just be hunter-gatherers. And if you want to say the Europeans showed up and just destroyed all these cities and all these monuments and stuff, first off, like what a logistical undertaking of doing that, and what an amazing cover-up in a time when it might have been more difficult to cover such things up. And also, why would I guess maybe the English lied about some grand civilizations that existed in North America, but the Spaniards told the truth about the Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations, and there's just and all the records have just been massively scrubbed. I mean, that's quite a case, and there's a lot of you would have to say a lot. There's a lot to prove there. This massive cover-up of Europeans moving into the east coast of the modern United States and wiping out a civilization of 2.5 million people. Because such a civilization would have had to have large-scale farming, would have had to have what we call cities, and all those things would have to have been destroyed, and it would have just been... I mean, it's just crazy. It's just crazy the amount of stuff that has to have occurred if North America did in fact have a population of even 10 million. And Jared Diamond is saying 20 million, right? He's saying a population of around 5 million in the modern day U.S. East Coast, right? Twice that of what it was in 1776. It's goofy, and it's frankly, it's retarded. It's something, and it's unbecoming. It's something that like when you actually sit down and think about it and break it down and think about what a population of 20 million in North America would actually mean logistically, right? What it would mean to feed that many people, what a population density that large looks like when it exists, say, down in Mexico, or when it exists down in the Andes, what a population density like that actually looks like structurally. It doesn't look like the Ojibwa. It doesn't look like the Cherokee looked. Right? It looks like the Aztecs looked. It looks like the Mesoamericans looked. It looks like the Inca looked, right? With cities and roads and ports and merchants and kings and armies and stuff. Basically, there's multiple lines of evidence. This has been refuted from the genetic record to the archaeological record regarding the number of sites and regarding the carrying capacity of what an advanced hunter-gatherer civilization typically has. All lines of evidence point to a population of around 1.6 to 3.5 million people. We'll just say, we'll be generous and say maybe 4 million people. Maybe. That's probably a bit too high. Certainly there were not 20 million people in North America. And for Jared Diamond to say that there were, this is real. This is something that he just couldn't have thought through. Because if he thought it through just a little bit, he would see just how virtually impossible that is. And it really is a mark against his credibility for him to say such a thing. 20 million people in North America. Crazy. There's no evidence of the kind of structures that would be needed to sustain a population that large. In his book, Jared Diamond repeats the smallpox blanket myth. Quote, "The skin lesions caused by smallpox similarly spread microbes by direct and indirect body contact, occasionally very indirect, as when U.S. whites, he says whites, when U.S. whites bent on wiping out belligerent Native Americans sent them gifts of blankets previously used by smallpox patients." Now, there's only one recorded attempt to spread smallpox to the Native Americans, and that was at Fort Pitt in 1763. The fort at the time was suffering from a smallpox epidemic while it was under siege by Siberian Americans during the French and Indian War. We know that one trader, as a merchant, William Trent, gave some Siberian American emissaries of the besieging forces, he gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief that he thought were infected with smallpox. We know this because Trent later sent a request to the fort commander to be compensated for this, and in his request, William Trent said that it was, quote, "to replace in kind those which were taken from people in the hospital to convey the smallpox to the Indians," close quote. Now, the reason this probably didn't work is because the forces in Fort Pitt probably got smallpox from the besieging Siberian Americans themselves. And so even if they succeeded in giving them blankets and handkerchiefs infested with smallpox, it wasn't going to have much of an effect because the disease had already passed over that population. And those that survived it had already survived it. This wasn't 1500, this was 1763, so we're well past the initial introduction of diseases that spread throughout the entirety of the Americas. There had been significantly more time for the Siberian Americans throughout all of the Americas to develop some sort of immunity to old world diseases. In addition, the historians who pushed the idea that there were more attempts at deliberate infection, they'll say that there's a lack of records of such attempts simply because the records weren't kept or they were destroyed and people just wouldn't report it, since such acts would have been considered monstrous at the time. And this is, of course, very convenient. Right? We can say, well, they did it. Well, where are the records? They wouldn't give you easy to access records now, would they? Well, you beat your children. And then you say, well, no, I don't. Well, you wouldn't admit to it now, would you? That's exactly what a child beater would say. I mean, it's this ridiculous sort of... So when Jared Diamond says that Europeans deliberately spread smallpox in this little commentary in this book, this one little passage that I'm focusing on quite a bit, well, there's one recorded instance. And those people were themselves suffering from a smallpox epidemic, and a few of them thought to try to give it to the besieging Siberian American forces, and they hoped to give them smallpox in hopes of lifting the siege. When you hear someone say the Europeans were trying to give the Native Americans smallpox by giving them smallpox-infested blankets, well, that sort of implies that there's a grand strategy from on high, and this was a general tactic as anything else. as anything else in warfare, but it wasn't a kind of general strategy. Now, I'm sure there were more than just William Trent or Jeffrey Amherst at Fort Pitt who did this. There are a lot of people in the Americas, and I'm sure that there were some Europeans who tried to spread diseases to Siberian Americans here and there in ways that weren't recorded. Just given how many people there were probably some who tried that. And you could say the same thing about any kind of horrible acts. You could point to some individuals, you could point to some Siberian Americans who did horrible things, and it's like, sure, whatever, people do horrible things from time to time. But to take the inherent awfulness that is present in humanity and to twist that into some general thing about a specific population, there's a term for that, it's called a blood libel. These kinds of accusations against an entire group need to be treated as a form of hate speech. Because what is the point? What is the point of saying a group, committed XYZ atrocity, and you're throwing that accusation out there cavalierly with very scant or no evidence? What is the purpose of doing that? I mean, there can only be one purpose, is to get people to hate that group. The smallpox blanket tale needs to be treated as a form of hate speech used to justify first ill feeling toward white people, and then laws against white people being able to speak and organize, and then laws to discriminate against white people in universities and in the corporate world. And let's not pretend to not understand the way in which the smallpox blanket story is a blood libel. If I were to say that Siberian Americans targeted children in their raids on European settlements, and my evidence for this was one instance where that happened, that would be a blood libel. You can pretend to be autistic and say that, well, technically some did, but clearly by saying Siberian Americans targeted children, that is meant to convey that that is a general policy. Not that it was just some one-off event or you had one guy who was like a mass murderer. When you say that, what is meant to be conveyed is that that was a general policy of the Siberian Americans. So the same thing is true when someone claims that Europeans deliberately spread diseases. And then you bring up one example or speculate about unrecorded examples. The point of that is to convey a general policy, and that is the lie. But why does Jared Diamond even mention this? This isn't relevant to his core theory about the domesticability of crops and animals, but he slides it in anyway. And this is where we're getting into sort of the underlying motivations of Jared Diamond. At the beginning of his book, Jared Diamond dedicates it to, quote, to Isa, Karaniga, Omwai, Paran, Sawakari, Wiwar, and all my other New Guinea friends and teachers, masters of a difficult environment. Now, you'd think if you were writing about historical staple crops, animals, and fertility, your dedication would be to all the people who actually did relevant research on those topics, which you are now collating into a central thesis. Why not dedicate Julius Caesar for describing what aurochs were like in 50 BC. Oh, wait a minute, Jared Diamond didn't bother to look into that. I looked into that because I actually cared about comparing aurochs to bison. A kind of basic research, even if it's kind of a subjective analysis, a kind of basic level of research that Jared Diamond, I guess, is above or whatever. He has a PhD, so he doesn't look into such simple questions like that, I guess. Jared Diamond spent about 33 years going back and forth to New Guinea. At the beginning of Guns, Germs, and Steel, he calls the question about why Europe was so much more advanced than the rest of the world for about 500 years, he calls that Yali's question. Yali being from now on, I'll refer to Papua New Guineans and Australian Aborigines, I'll refer to them as Melanesians, just for simplicity's sake. And Yali was just a Melanesian who asked that question. And this is just so obnoxious, because that's a question. Why Europe diverged from the rest of the world is a question that millions have asked long before Europeans ever even made contact with the Melanesians. I have nothing against this Yali guy. I don't know who Yali is, but it would be like if some guy, Frank, last week asked me where our souls go when we die or whatever, and I declared that to be Frank's question. Jared Diamond calling the debate surrounding the divergence of Europe from the rest of the world Yali's question, it's just childish, and it reveals a lot about his biases. That some Papuan, that some Melanesian asked a question, and Jared is calling it this Melanesian guy's question, as opposed to like literally everyone else on the planet's question who asked it, hundreds of years earlier. Now, Guns, Germs, and Steel also has, and I'll use that word again, an obnoxious amount of space devoted to why Papua New Guinea and Australia was so far behind Eurasia. In this video, and again, I'm sort of writing this at the end, I don't think I even once mentioned Australia or Papua New Guinea before this section, before this last section here. Maybe I did once or twice, but I don't think I mentioned it even once. And if I did, it was only once or twice. And the reason for that is because it's not a relevant part of the world. And given the geographic isolation, and given that it's mostly jungles, deserts and a few mountains, and it's off in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by oceans, sure, it seems that Jared Diamond may have a point regarding the geography for the development of Papua New Guineans and Australian Aborigines. And so I think Jared Diamond actually developed his environmental determinist theory based on Papua New Guinea, which is a fringe part of the world where the environmental limitations he is fixated on seem like they might actually matter. But then Jared extrapolates this onto everything else. He tries to explain the divergence of Europe from, say, India and China in the same environmental deterministic lens that is not, that there's no reason to think it would be anywhere near as appropriate as it would be for Papua New Guinea and Australia being backward compared to the rest of the world. Now, Jared Diamond is also not a big fan of IQ. Imagine that. Well, what does IQ research have to say about the IQs of Australians and Papua New Guineans, the kinds of people that Jared Diamond dedicated his book to? Well, it puts them at the lowest IQ of any broad, what we call broad general population, continental population category on the planet. You can use continental populations, or you can use races. It doesn't matter what word you use. We know what we're talking about, and they genetically cluster, and we can genetically distinguish them from each other. It puts them at the lowest IQ of any continental population on the planet, and there are some reported numbers that you'll get that are higher than this, but this comes from admixed populations in urban Australia. If you get like the pure-blooded Australian abos, you're getting IQs of around 70. And of course, IQ is one of the most well-validated psychometric and general social science metrics in existence, which is to say it is probably the most predictively powerful thing in all of social science. For example, it predicts job performance better than education level or past job experience. And so you have enormous, and it predicts subjective perception of a person's intelligence better than education level. How well someone does on a 30-minute IQ test has a better predictive ability on how subjectively intelligent a person is perceived than does how many years they spent in school. And so you have enormous emotional resistance to IQ, but also enormous predictive power of IQ. And this is stuff I talk about in proper depth and proper citation and going in all the studies and tables and stuff in other videos, which will be linked in the description if you're interested. Job performance, income, all sorts of life outcomes like life expectancy, whether or not you get addicted to drugs, children out of wedlock, STDs, like everything. Like you name it, IQ is going to predict it, and it's going to predict it in a way you would expect. And even subjective perception of intelligence are all predicted by IQ better than just about anything else. That IQ is the best general predictor for life outcomes. Now, for specific life outcomes, there may be something that predicts better for whether or not you're going to get an STD than IQ. There may be something that will predict better how good you are at making pizza than IQ. But there's no one single predictor that predicts everything in the way IQ does. IQ tests have been refined for over 100 years, and it's all based on very abstract questions that the idea is you can't study for this, and that can be used to predict an underlying general intelligence factor to some degree or another in just about anything. And I don't want to go into that here. I don't want to go because I can talk about IQ for longer than I can talk about Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you think this is a long video, I can talk about IQ 5-6 times longer than this in a stretch. So let's look at what Jared Diamond has to say about IQ. He says, quote, "An enormous effort by cognitive psychologists has gone into the search for differences in IQ between peoples of different geographic origins now living in the same country. In particular, numerous white American psychologists," points it out, white American psychologists, "have been trying for decades to demonstrate that black Americans of African origin are innately less intelligent than white Americans of European origins. However, As is well known, the peoples compared differ greatly in their social environment and educational opportunities. This fact creates double difficulties for efforts to test the hypothesis that intellectual differences underlie technological differences. First, even our cognitive abilities as adults are heavily influenced by the social environment that we experience during childhood, making it hard to discern any influence of pre-existing genetic differences. Second, the test of cognitive ability, like IQ tests, tend to measure cultural learning and not pure innate intelligence, whatever that is. Because of those undoubted effects of childhood environment and learned knowledge on IQ test results, the psychologist's efforts to date have not succeeded in convincingly establishing the postulated genetic deficiency in IQs of non-white peoples. And now Jared Diamond will never be convinced, so that's a bogus weasel word. He will never be convinced, so he'll declare everything unconvincing. So now the degree to which Jared's, I guess, blank slate, but not quite blank slate, as I'll talk about later, his ideas for intelligence have been refuted cannot be overstated. Today, we're actually starting to find the genes, and we're getting into game over territory on this race and intelligence stuff. We're no longer having to use inferential quantitative genetics. We're getting right down to molecular genetics, and we're getting to a point soon where serious debate is going to be over. No longer are you going to have to trust the results of twin studies. No longer are we going to have to look into, subtest heritability analysis or longitudinal analysis. We're getting to the point where we can just find the genes. We know with a good degree of certainty what each gene does, and then we can look at the prevalence of each allele, how they are distributed between populations. And we can get to just a straight up direct genetic measure of intelligence. We're getting into that game over territory, and it's right now it's looking, the molecular genetic evidence is looking like the old quantitative genetic evidence, the inferential evidence. It's all being confirmed, and this whole charade is going to be over. Right, we're going to be done. Right, and the arguments are going to be a lot simpler, because no longer am I going to have to bring up twin studies and subtest heritability and longitudinal analysis and argue against cultural bias. No, eventually I'm just going to straight up just point at the genes, and that's going to be it. But even back in Jared's day, his claims that psychologists were fixated on blacks being less intelligent, what about the opposite? What about all the work and all the propaganda pushed on kids in schools that everyone's the same? I mean, it just seems crazy, just ludicrous. And maybe this is my warped perception, but it seems ludicrous, some idea that there's like some general program to get people to believe blacks are less intelligent, when it's the opposite. It's clearly the opposite. Should we not be concerned about the negative consequences that the belief in equality has had? For example, there are and were, in Jared's time, laws discriminating against white people in government jobs, and laws allowing for discrimination against white people in universities and in companies, and the justification for these laws were that whites were still in better socioeconomic positions on average. And since there could be no innate biological differences between the two races on average, then this must be down to some sort of socioeconomic factors, some correctable socioeconomic or cultural environmental factors. Right, and that is then used to justify discrimination against whites, because the belief is, they didn't use the term privileged at the time, but that's basically what it was. That's basically what has been going on since the 90s, is a belief in white privilege, and that justifies the discrimination against whites because they have privilege. They didn't use that term back then, but that's what the reasoning for affirmative action was since 1965. And this reasoning is not benign, it's not liberal, it is a primordial kind of racial rape and revenge narrative used to justify laws against whites. It's very primitive. It's, he has something, I want it, that's unfair. It's envious, it's vindictive, and it's tribal. Okay, it's not enlightened. Right? It is a kind of racial revanchism. Jared says, quote, "However, as is well known, the peoples compared differ greatly in their social environment and educational opportunities." And he just says this stuff in a book. But Jared, it's been shown through twin studies that doesn't matter. Socioeconomic adoption studies have also shown conclusively and repeatedly that the socioeconomic status of your biological parents determines almost everything. And the socioeconomic status of your adopting parents determines almost nothing. And voucher studies have shown that good schools and bad schools are a myth. The kids who apply and get vouchers do exactly the same as those who apply and don't get vouchers. Kids who apply for vouchers are just better on average, and so they do better on average, whether they get the vouchers or not. The school itself doesn't matter. Parents that you have, 99% of the time, there may be some fringe cases where it's literal child abuse and malnutrition where it would matter, but barring that, it doesn't matter. Okay? What matters is the genes of the person, and which is why your biological parents is going to predict how you're going to be, whereas your adoptive parents won't. Jared also doesn't even mention the validity of the general intelligence factor, and perhaps he doesn't even know what that even is. And he treats a kind of blank slate view of intellectual capacity as a default, which is bizarre given how much he studies the biodiversity of plants and animals. He brings up all these objections to IQ, but it's like, okay, well Jared, what are you saying? Are you saying they're the same? Are you saying everyone's the same? How does that happen? Right? You're like kind of an evolutionary. I don't know exactly what he got his PhD in. It was 1961, so long ago. It's kind of irrelevant at this point. But I mean, obviously, Jared Diamond deals in evolutionary biology and researches evolutionary biology. So certainly from that frame of reference, you can see why it might be kind of implausible that all these populations around the world would be exactly the same in the brain, especially since we know from modern MRI studies, like we're no longer just measuring the inside of skulls with shot pellets, which of course were validated, by the way. Check the New York Times article showing that Stephen Jay Gould was straight up fabricating his claims about people like Morton, and that they actually had Morton's collection of skulls, and the people who housed his collection actually measured it, and they found that Morton was telling the truth, and that the racial disparities in cranial capacities that Morton was talking about in the 1800s were actually real. Anyway, so but when you have like these morphological differences in the brain size, which we have like modern studies from the 2000s and modern studies using MRIs and other imaging techniques, it's no longer having to measure the volume with like shot pellet or whatever. It's over. Like that is in the past. We're using modern brain size studies. Modern brain size studies say, yeah, the races, they do differ in average brain size, and not only brain size, but brain shape, different relative sizes of the lobes. And what Jared Diamond here is saying is that, well, there's no difference in intellectual capacity. Whatever your qualms are with IQ, maybe you say, oh, there's some cultural bias here or there, whatever. I mean, there isn't, as I'll talk about in a moment. But even if you think all that stuff, what are you trying to say? Where are you going with this? Are you going into the la la land of a bizarro world of like everyone's the same? Like how does that possibly happen? How do people who evolve differences in every other part of the body but not the brain? Although we do know that they evolve differences in the brain based on differences in brain size and shape, but not function. There's no difference in function there. Well, there is differences in innate function. I think most people, including Jared, recognize that there are biological innate differences in intellectual capacity between individuals. Bob can be inherently more intelligent than Steve at math, for example. But once you get into the level of large populations, then what? Then they must be the same? So I get like these they're throwing all this fire and fury signifying nothing against IQ, stuff that has been refuted decades before even Jared Diamond wrote his book. But then it's like, okay, but then what are they saying? Are they saying that like evolution didn't apply to the brain? Or excuse me, that evolution didn't apply to the brain in function. Now it did in morphology, but it didn't apply in any functional sense. Like there's no like even though that there's well measured and well documented differences in brain size and brain and shapes of the relative lobe sizes, but there's no functional difference from that, even though we have massive differences in observed behavior between these populations, and even though we recognize that there are innate biological differences between any two individuals. We're just saying that once you get into populations that are large enough to be considered the traditional continental populations or races, then they must, by some law of the universe, be the same on average. But the thing is, Jared Diamond's not looking inward onto his assumption. He's just throwing out a bunch of smoke with some bogus, lame-ass criticisms of IQ that have been refuted decades before even he wrote his book. Anyway, enough of that rant. So another quote here, he says, second, tests of cognitive ability like IQ tests tend to measure cultural learning and not pure innate intelligence, whatever that is. Right? And he says whatever that is, like that's bullshit. Like what is called the general intelligence factor, is another one of these well-validated things. We have a very good idea of it. There's been long-running debates about, multifactorial and single-factorial intelligence, and the reality is that there's a mixture of both, right? There is this general intelligence factor, but there's also specific subdomains of intelligence, and it's like there's been so much work on that. Jared Diamond, you don't know what you're talking about. You're treating something as trivial with something that has been just massively researched to a degree that you cannot even begin to comprehend. But the thing is, this cultural bias nonsense has been dealt with to death, and it's been refuted in so many ways. One way is that the predictive validity of all life outcomes is the same regardless of race. That IQ test predicts future life performance for blacks as well as it does for whites, as well as it does for Asians, as well as it does for Hispanics. So if these tests are in fact quote unquote culturally biased, well, they just so happen to be precisely as culturally biased as the rest of the world. Okay, and as far back as 1983, Cecil Reynolds took a bunch of white people and black people who all had an IQ of 89. And what he found is that blacks, relative to whites, did better on information and arithmetic, and insignificantly worse on vocabulary, and all this points to the opposite of what Jared Diamond is saying. That the more a test is a function of training and education and culture, the lower the black-white IQ gap is. Right? And this ties back to the subtest heritability studies. The more a test is found to be influenced by genetic factors, as inferred from twin studies, the higher the racial gaps are. Right, the exact opposite of what you would predict if you think there's a big cultural bias thing. And the fact that blacks and whites with the same IQ, blacks do better on information and arithmetic and insignificantly worse on vocabulary, this points to the idea that if anything, that the more the test is a measure of cultural knowledge, the better blacks are going to do, and that the more a test is a test of sort of abstract stuff, like kind of the progressive matrices and pattern completion and visual spatial reasoning, that's where, and object assembly with blocks and stuff, that's where the racial gaps are in fact the largest, right? Which all points to literally the opposite. If anything, the cultural bias of the IQ tests results in the gaps being artificially small, right? The cultural bias on the IQ tests actually favors blacks. If you got rid of the cultural portions of the IQ tests, then the racial gaps would actually be wider. If you threw out information, arithmetic, and vocabulary, the racial gaps would be larger, not smaller. Okay? That is how comprehensively bullshit this cultural bias argument is. This just ties into a running theme with Jared Diamond, is that whenever Jared says something that can be looked up, it always ends up being wrong. So he has all these demands on IQ, throwing out accusations of cultural bias or racist motives, not considering that the racist rape and revenge narrative that is being pushed by denying any biological difference between the populations. Right? He's not considering the other side. He's not considering that when you look at atrocities all throughout history, it's always motivated by some sort of revenge and some sort of claimed thing that was done against them. I mean, that's what the Nazis did all the time when they went into Poland and Eastern Europe. They claimed that the Bolsheviks did some sort of thing against Christians. And it was convoluted, sure, but it was always in the context of revenge. Right? Atrocity is always done in the context of revenge. And when you deny biological differences between populations, you say, well, it's not, these people aren't better off just because they're like genetically like more intelligent or more prone to doing things that make money. No, they're better off because they're exploiting us, or they're benefiting from the exploitation of the past, or they're doing something wrong, or they're benefiting from something wrong that happened, and we deserve restitution for that. Okay, rape and revenge. It's not liberal, it's not progressive, it's not enlightened, it's primitive. It's primitive as fuck. Don't be fooled into thinking Jared Diamond is a pure blank slater here. Oh no. No, Jared Diamond believes that Melanesians are innately more intelligent than Europeans, and he has an evolutionary explanation for why this is. So let me read this. Quote, this is from Jared. He says, "My perspective on this controversy," it's not a controversy, it's a phony controversy. It's a fabricated controversy, fabricated by people who don't want to recognize facts. But anyway, My perspective on this controversy comes from 33 years of working with New Guineans in their own intact societies. From the very beginning of my work with New Guineans, they impressed me as being, on the average, more intelligent, more alert, more expressive, and more interested in things and people around them than the average European or American is. Fair enough, that's probably true. I mean, if you, for example, I'm thinking about when, some African tribes people were shown an ice cube, they were very much interested in that. Whereas if you showed you or me an ice cube, we would be like, that's going to melt and it's going to be a mess. Get that away, right? So sure, I guess they're more interested, but I'm not sure what Jared thinks that's going to mean. Continuing, at some tasks that one might reasonably suppose to reflect aspects of brain function, such as the ability to form a mental map of unfamiliar surroundings, they appear considerably more adept than Westerners. Now it's funny. Now this is actually very funny, and this shows that Jared Diamond doesn't know what he's talking about when he poo-poos IQ research, because IQ researchers have for a very long time pointed out that two groups of people, Eskimos, Inuits, and Melanesians, and Eskimos, Inuits, Polynesians, not the black-skinned Pacific people, but sort of the browner ones, and the black-skinned Pacific Island peoples, the Melanesians, that these three groups have uniquely good visual spatial reasoning. And it makes sense because these are populations that would travel from island to island. And those that could, through dead reckoning, better travel from island to island would be better. So this is actually something that has been validated by IQ research. And if Jared Diamond knew anything about IQ research, he almost certainly would have mentioned that here. That in terms of being the ability to form a mental map of unfamiliar surroundings, yeah, that is something that the Eskimos and the Inuits are uniquely good at. In fact, the region of the brain, I can't remember offhand which one it is also is said to be like physically larger in Eskimos than it is in just about anyone else. Not only do Eskimos have the physically largest brains of any what we call continental population in the world, but of the physically largest overall brain, the region that is dedicated to visual spatial reasoning is larger as well. And the same thing I think is also true with Melanesians and Polynesians. So anyway, so Jared Diamond is saying this, and I guess he thinks this is some knowledge that he has that the psychometricians don't have. But no, the psychometricians actually know this, and they know of two other populations that are like this. So Jared, you don't even he's writing this, and he's thinking he's telling us something that we don't know, but we already knew this long before, and we know why this is. We know physiologically like why this is. So like, shut the fuck up, Jared. You're not teaching us anything. Anyway, continue. He says, of course, New Guineans tend to perform poorly on tasks that Westerners have been trained to perform since childhood and that New Guineans have not. Hence, when unschooled New Guineans from remote villages visit towns, they look stupid to Westerners. Conversely, I am constantly aware of how stupid I look to New Guineans when I'm with them in the jungle, displaying my incompetence at simple tasks, such as following a jungle trail or erecting a shelter, at which New Guineans have been trained since childhood and I have not. It's easy to recognize two reasons why my impression that New Guineans are smarter than Westerners may be correct. First, Europeans have for thousands of years been living in densely populated societies with central governments, police, and judiciaries. In those societies, infectious epidemic diseases of dense populations, such as smallpox, were historically the major cause of death, while murders were relatively uncommon and a state of war was the exception rather than the rule. Most Europeans who escaped fatal infections also escaped other potential causes of death and proceeded to pass on their genes. Today, most live-born Western infants survive fatal infections as well and reproduce themselves regardless of their intelligence and the genes they bear. In contrast, New Guineans have been living in societies where human numbers were too low for epidemic diseases of dense populations to evolve. Instead, traditional New Guineans suffered high mortality from murder, chronic tribal warfare, accidents, and problems in procuring food. So this is very interesting. This is something now, and it's funny because when Jared Diamond talks about the he's describing kind of what in the past would be called dysgenic fertility. Now, dysgenic I think is a bad term, because what is genic is that which reproduces. So the concept of dysgenics is bogus on its face. But what he's saying is that less intelligent Europeans are able to reproduce and survive because of civilization.
It doesn't matter if you're on your community or on tour. We need to keep ourselves and our countrymen safe. You never know when a car is going to come along. The road is for cars, not for sleeping or playing around. Care about where you sleep. At night, the driver wants to see you. Bright clothes like white and yellow are good. We want to do things the right way in our community. So let's get road safety right.
Authorised by the Northern Territory Government.
Hey, what are you doing? Don't sleep on the road.
Don't sleep on the road! Brothers, sisters, brothers, sisters, my friend, could we stand together? Look at us, we can live forever. Show me sister, show me brother, and we stand strong for one another. Come on, come on, come on, come on, yeah! Come on, come on. We put the leaders of one lands. You don't save petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the high space. Don't be rama-rama, messing with your brain. You say you're deadly, do you understand? You don't sniff petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the car it goes. Don't be rama-rama, sniffing up your nose. Don't be rama, 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 don't be rama. Love your friends, protect your family. They are with you when you are lonely. Don't bandera, don't bandera. When you stop, your brains will be clear. Come on, come on, come on, come on, yeah! Come on, come on. We could the leaders of another lands. You don't save petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the high space. Don't be rama-rama, messing with your brain. You say you're deadly, do you understand? You don't save petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the car it goes. Don't be rama-rama, sniffing up your nose.
You not deadly, you rama-rama. Gonna get caught like Dylan Osama.
Yeah, yeah, I tell you, 'cause I can, yeah, I tell you.
When I was walking in the street, see the boys and girls are sleeping too much petrol. Killing your brains,
We could the leaders of another lands. You don't save petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the high space. Don't be rama-rama, messing with your brain. You say you're deadly, do you understand? You don't save petrol from a can. You put the petrol in the car it goes. Don't be rama-rama, sniffing up your nose. Use your brains, think about your culture.
Whereas out in the wild, you don't have that luxury. Like, if you're dumb, you die. So this is interesting that this guy would say that, because this is a very, like, I think on the facts, I think he's just factually wrong about this, that early civilization actually inordinately selects for what it is we classify as general intelligence. But this is a kind of thinking that is very evolutionary kind of thinking that people with his ultimate position tend not to have, right? Let me put it this way. People who think in these evolutionary terms tend to never come to the kind of conclusions that Jared Diamond is coming to here. So, now, and I've actually made a video on this entitled The European Revolution, where I show quite conclusively that Jared Diamond is totally wrong about this, especially regarding Northwest Europe, England, the Low Countries, and the Calais area, northeastern France, right? Or what we call the North Sea area generally. That in this region, and to a lesser extent radiating out from that region, is where the feudal structures, actually the laws that sort of emerged in the area almost by happenstance, had a selective effect to select against violence and to select for socioeconomically successful people, where the higher classes were basically genetically replacing the lower classes, and the violent people, that even petty criminals, were being given draconian sentences and were being executed. And sure, there were some people who got accused of a crime they didn't do, or people who weren't genetically predisposed to violence, but just circumstance led them to do something that would die. But in the broad scheme of things, you're selecting against, to the extent that there's any genetic component to criminality, you're going to be selecting against those genes. You're going to be killing those people off disproportionately. And so you're killing off criminal people, which tend to be less intelligent on average. That's not the only factor that goes into criminality, but low intelligence is one contributing factor to criminality. You know, being able to not plan things out or foresee the consequences of doing stuff and acting impulsively is something that less intelligent people are more likely to do. And they selected for people who are economically successful, which correlates with intelligence. Again, not perfectly, there's always exceptions, but like as a rule, for the entire population of rich people is going to be smarter than the entire population of poor people. And so there's actually reasons, and there's good documented evidence as to why what Jared Diamond is saying about Europe in particular is just overwhelmingly wrong. And in fact, it was this genetic change that coincided with the age of exploration and then the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, what I call the European Revolution, and I have a video where I document these genetic changes going on all throughout Europe, most concentrated in the North Sea area, that it was this massive genetic change throughout Western Europe that then coincided with the age of exploration and ultimately the Industrial Revolution. So I find it interesting that Jared Diamond is thinking a little bit on sort of evolutionary biological terms, but he's thinking about it in a very simplistic way and also like in a very speculative way. Like the way I do it, I actually I do far more research than Jared Diamond does. Jared Diamond is a far more speculative kind of guy. He just sort of says stuff. He says stuff and then like people listen to him because the New York Times tell the dumb clapping seals to listen to Jared Diamond. But no, like what Jared is saying here is like literally 180 degrees the opposite. Go watch my video, The European Revolution. It's a fantastic video, if I do say so myself, but it'll give you a much better and much more rigorously and comprehensively argued for case for why Europe diverged from the rest of the world. And it does have to do with a genetic change. A genetic change that occurred starting around 1100 AD, most concentrated in the North Sea area. And it had to do with the Hanal line, having to do with the way, the incentives for reproduction in the manors. So anyway, Jared Diamond poo-poos IQ research. He throws out all these ancient, long ago, comprehensively refuted arguments about IQ, and then claims Melanesians are inherently more intelligent using just another evolutionary just so story. Now, this isn't liberal, this isn't equalitarian, not that I'm endorsing those things, but I'm just saying that Jared Diamond isn't even one of those guys. He's not even one of those stilted sort of all is equal nutters. No, Jared Diamond is a pure racial chauvinist. When I talk about IQ, I show what the data says. And the IQ data has all these racial averages, but they also have big differences within various subgroups and populations, and variation of what kinds of tests they do well on, with some tests being more environmentally malleable than others, and some tests being more a function of genes. Sometimes, white race is best race, and sometimes it isn't, right? It's a far more nuanced take than it's described by its opponents. It's described by its opponents as some sort of bizarre obsession with rank, order, and supremacy. And people who say that, people who talk about psychometricians as if they're obsessed with rank order and supremacy, these are people who don't know anything about the topic, or they're lying. For Jared to say that psychometricians are obsessed with proving racial superiority is a sign that Jared either hasn't read the first thing about this topic, or he's just getting his knowledge, secondhand from someone else, or he's just lying. And of course, Jared doesn't use the proper term. He doesn't use the term psychometrician. He uses psychologist. Right, which is, again, this is another sign. This is a sign that Jared Diamond hasn't even read the bell curve when he wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. That he hadn't even read. He doesn't even know the proper terminology, the basic terminology for this topic. Don't sleep on the road. Jared Diamond's master race, IQ 72. Despite having been in Australia for several generations and having a panoply of racial quotas favoring them at the expense of whites, they have to have campaigns going around telling them to not sleep on the road. And Jared's argument regarding Melanesians would apply to all hunter-gatherers. Jared is saying that hunter-gatherers, as a rule, they're going to be more intelligent than populations that evolved within sedentary civilizations, because they don't have the luxury of civilization, so the stupid people in where they live are going to die off. But the only measure by which this is ever said to be proven is that hunter-gatherers are better at the hunter-gatherer lifestyle than sedentary civilized people are. When those people are immediately thrust out into the bush, boy, they sure do look stupid compared to the Melanesians. Now, with IQ, we have all sorts of socioeconomic controls. We have school controls, parental controls. We don't just give an IQ test to some hunter-gatherers and regale at how much smarter we are than them. No, we take people who were born and raised in civilization and had more or less the same IQ-relevant environment. That's the point of the voucher studies. That's the point of adoption studies. That's the point of twin studies. But when Jared takes some white people and just throws them into the bush with no experience or training, and then he laughs at how stupid they look. If psychometricians tried to do that with IQ tests, that would be considered malpractice, and the guy doing it would probably and rightfully be blackballed from the field. Yet that is essentially what Jared Diamond does to show that Melanesians are innately more intelligent than Europeans. And then he has his evolutionary biological theory, this speculated theory about why that would happen, that he just sort of cooks up without looking at any of the basic evidence that shows that he is totally wrong, that civilization, especially early civilization, selects for intelligence far more than a hunter-gatherer civilization, than hunter-gatherer peoples do. And this line of reasoning that he's come up with, he came up with it after spending, by his words, 33 years working with the Melanesians. So he came up with this after spending 33 years working with the Melanesians, saying that the Melanesians were more intelligent because by his accounting, by his perception of their ability to navigate by dead reckoning, they seem to be more intelligent than other peoples. This guy's a fucking racist, pure and simple, and he's grasping at whatever he can to say Melanesians are better than white people. His entire thesis only makes sense when you're dealing with an irrelevant part of the world. His environmental determinist thesis only makes sense when you're looking at New Guinea and Australia. And you read the introduction, Yali's question, he basically explains that that's how this whole ball got rolling. He started this line of reasoning that led to the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, based on how he explained the backwardness of the Melanesians. If you're going to talk about, for example, why Europe diverged from the rest of the world, maybe you'd want to have knowledge about places like, you'd want to look at China and India and the Middle East and Mesoamerica and the Andes. And you'd look at all these places, and then you would have a very special focus on Europe to try to figure out the ways in which Europe was different from everyone else. You wouldn't spend one moment looking at Papua New Guinea. You would spend about as much time looking at Papua New Guinea as you would looking at Patagonia, or as you would looking at the Khoi people or the Pygmies or the San Bushmen in South Africa. You wouldn't spend them any mind. Right? These are irrelevant parts of the world for the questions that we're looking into. But that's where Jared started. He started at this irrelevant part of the world, and he started there because he spent 33 years there, and I think he started to go native. He started to identify with the Melanesians, and that's all this bullshit is. He should be mocked and shamed and then forgotten as being nothing more than a pseudo-intellectual bigot.